Chapter 263. So, the ones who tried to assassinate Earl Amon last night were the dwarves? Joyce's childish voice echoed in the meeting hall of the Lion's Roar Castle. The captain of the House of St. Hilda's Guards, Knight Chester, replied respectfully, "Young master, there was indeed a dwarf warrior who fought with me last night, but I don't think it was this corpse." Faced with Joyce's stupid question, Knight Chester had no choice but to patiently explain, "Young master, to be able to fight with me without losing, the other party was at least a 5th-grade warrior. How could a 5th-grade warrior be crushed to death by a collapsed warehouse?" "Oh." Joyce nodded. Then, he had a flash of inspiration and asked, "What about a 4th-grade warrior?" "I don't think so." Joyce's eyes lit up when he heard this answer. It was as if he had discovered something incredible. So, as a 4th-grade knight, Thomas shouldn't have been crushed to death by the ceiling of the church, right? He must have died in the confessional before that, right? That's possible? Knight Chester was a little embarrassed. For a moment, he didn't know whether to praise Joyce for being smart or call him stupid. Helpless, he could only look at Butler Dankton. He was probably saying, "Don't make me clean up your mess. Then we should examine the body of Knight Thomas and find out what the cause of his death was." Joyce, the clever one, exclaimed. Just as he was about to explain himself, he saw a tall figure walking in through the door. "You're right. You're right. You're right. You're right." Then, Archbishop Akani's languid and bewitching voice sounded. "Young Master Joyce, Knight Thomas was indeed crushed to death. A huge rock with a sharp edge happened to fall on his head, resulting in this misfortune. Sister Ajani." Joyce immediately jumped down from his seat and held Ajani's hand affectionately. Seeing this, the Knight of Chester frowned. In fact, the captain of the House of St. Hilda was well aware of the current power struggle in the Lion's Roar Castle. However, he did not have any bias. Whether it was Joyce or Vera inheriting the title of Duke, he did not have any opinion. But now, looking at Joyce who was trying to please Ajani, Knight Chester felt a sense of disgust rise from the bottom of his heart. How could the Dukes of the North be people who would wag their tails and act cute in front of the church? At this moment, Joyce was indeed like a puppy trying to please its owner in front of Ajani. He had originally suspected that there was something fishy about Knight Thomas's death, but after Ajani's explanation, he completely believed that Thomas had been killed by the collapsing ceiling of the church. As for why the ceiling of the church suddenly collapsed, well, of course, it was caused by a lightning strike. Knight Chester, who had always been neutral, was speechless at how easy it was to pass the test. However, when he saw Earl Amon's head, he sneered in his heart. Vera's people were not simple either. There would be a good show to watch next. Young Master Joyce, the most important thing now is to appoint a new commander of the City Defense Army. In addition, the Oman family's army also needs a new commander so that it will not cause chaos. Joyce certainly would not refuse Ajani's suggestion. He nodded and said, "Okay. Archbishop, do you have any suggestions for the commander of the City Defense Army?" Ajani smiled gently and shook her head. "The secular world belongs to the Lord, and the faith belongs to the gods. Young Master Joyce, the appointment of the commander of the City Defense Army is not up to me to decide." "Well, you have some shame." Knight Chester secretly cursed. However, he also knew that Ajani was just pretending to refuse. The real candidate must have been discussed long ago. How could she rely on a 10-year-old child like Joyce to make the decision? Sure enough, Joyce could not make up his mind at all. He turned to Butler Durden and asked, "Durden, who do you think is more suitable?" The old butler smiled reservedly and suggested, "Young master, I think Knight Lewis is a good choice. He is the deputy commander of the Golden Lion Legion and has experience in leading troops. He is also brave in battle and loyal to the House of St. Hilda. He will definitely be a qualified commander of the City Defense Army." Joyce did not think much and immediately nodded. "Okay, then let Knight Lewis take over the City Defense Army." Knight Lewis stepped forward and knelt down on one knee in front of Joyce, saying loudly, "Thank you for your trust, young Master Joyce." Immediately, Butler Dington drafted a letter of appointment and handed it to Joyce. Joyce signed it excitedly, as if he had really become one of the Dukes of the North at this moment. This feeling of being able to dictate the fate of others made Joyce feel a strange emotion. Perhaps he did not understand what it was called, but he was already uncontrollably addicted to it. Joyce suddenly understood why his father was always busy but never complained. In fact, he even enjoyed it. He used to be glad that he wasn't his father's eldest son, so he didn't have to worry about these tedious government affairs in the future. But now, he could finally understand his father's happiness. After signing the letter of appointment and handing it to Knight Lewis, Joyce looked around with his head held high, enjoying the feeling of being the focus of everyone's attention. Especially Archbishop Ajani's gaze, which was as cold as water but hid a surging charm. Joyce could no longer suppress the possessiveness in his heart. He really wanted to ask the butler if it was necessary to wait until after the coming-of-age ceremony to get married. Young master? Young master? What's wrong? Joyce was awakened by the butler's call and hurriedly retracted his greedy gaze from Ajani with a guilty conscience. However, the youth's adoration was already seen by everyone present. Some were happy to see it, while others frowned. Count Oman has unfortunately been murdered. We have to catch the culprit as soon as possible. Of course, more importantly, we have to appease the soldiers of the Oman family in the city, Butler Dington suggested again. Oman family? Joyce muttered to himself for a moment before looking around the meeting hall. Why don't I see Viscount's Vala? Butler Dington immediately explained, I have already sent someone to inform Viscount's Vala of the Count's death, and have also invited the Viscounts to the meeting hall for a discussion. But for some reason he has yet to appear. Are you injured and unable to come? Joyce asked. Knightchester replied, Young master, Viscount's Vala was indeed injured in last night's attack, but from what I can see, his injuries are not serious. Then send someone to hurry him. Joyce's face began to show impatience, as if his authority was being challenged. Butler Dington immediately replied and sent someone to inform Viscount's Vala. Joyce spoke again, then what about Count Oman's murderer? Knightchester, you said that the dwarf's corpse that was found together with Count Oman's head isn't the murderer? I don't think so. Knightchester explained patiently, as I said, the one I fought was a grade 5 dwarf warrior. He couldn't have been killed by a collapsed warehouse. The dwarf's corpse we found should only be a scapegoat. Furthermore, we only found Count Amon's head, but the rest of his body is missing. I'm guessing that the real murderer took it away. Then why did the murderer take Count Oman's body and leave only his head behind? Joyce asked curiously. I'm guessing that he wanted to hide something. Hide what? Joyce looked like he wouldn't give up until he got to the bottom of this. Knightchester felt a headache coming on. From his point of view, Joyce was acting like a typical child, constantly asking about unimportant things while ignoring the important ones. Fortunately, Archbishop Akani spoke up and brought the topic back on track. Young Master Joyce, the reason why the murderer took Count Amon's body isn't the main point. What we should be more concerned about is who planned the assassination of Count Amon. Joyce nodded. Then what do you think, Archbishop? Akani looked at Knightchester and asked, Knightchester, you said that there were 3 assassins last night. A large blue armored man, a short red armored man, and a strange man with huge wings? Akani's eyes flashed, and she suddenly laughed. It's not easy to guess the identities of those 2 armored men, but it's not the first time people with wings have appeared. Is that so? Joyce asked curiously, can people really grow wings? Seeing that Joyce's focus had shifted again, Akani smiled faintly and pulled the topic back. I'm not sure about that either. However, I know that during the coup in Silvery Moon City last year, a winged knight appeared. It's said to be a knight with huge wings. It should be the same person who appeared in Lion's Roar Castle this time. Winged knight. Joyce's eyes flashed with yearning, and he asked anxiously, then do you know his true identity, Archbishop? Archbishop Akani did not speak, but turned to look at the door of the conference hall. There, a valiant figure appeared. Chapter 264. Viscount Angley, are you lazing in bed? Joyce teased as he saw Colin walk in. Colin bowed, then chuckled, my apologies, young Master Joyce. I was disturbed by the thunder last night and did not sleep well. I did wake up late today. Joyce laughed for a while, then waved his hand to show his magnanimity. Akani looked at Colin with sparkling eyes and suddenly laughed. Viscount Angley, so many things happened last night. Don't you know anything? Colin's face was filled with sorrow and regret. He sighed. I heard about it just now. I did not expect Count Amon and Knight Thomas to meet with misfortune. It's really, sighed. The few old foxes present looked at the pretentious Colin and cursed in their hearts. They obviously knew that Colin was the prime suspect in Amon's death, but there was no evidence to prove that he was Count Amon's murderer. Viscount Angley. Akani's footsteps were light as she slowly approached Colin. Her deep blue eyes looked at him as she asked softly, Have you heard of the Winged Knight? I have. Colin's expression did not change. Back in Silvery Moon City, it was this guy who killed the previous half-elven king. Why are you suddenly asking about this? Because one of the people who participated in Count Amon's assassination last night was this Winged Knight. Is that so? Colin looked surprised, then pointed at the dwarf's corpse in the middle of the hall. So this Winged Knight belongs to the dwarves? Akani looked at Colin for a while, but could not see anything. She could not help but feel disappointed and said calmly, Perhaps. Although she guessed that the Winged Knight was most likely the secret weapon of the Angeli family, she did not have any concrete evidence, so she could only guess. Originally, Ajani had wanted to continue probing Colin about the Winged Knights, but all of a sudden, the Archbishop's expression changed, his eyes filled with disbelief and shock. Archbishop Akani, what's wrong? It was the first time Joyce had seen Akani lose her composure. At the same time, a strong sense of jealousy rose from the bottom of the little boy's heart. The goddess in his heart had actually lost her composure for another man. Colin furrowed his brows. The gaze of the mysterious archbishop made him feel uneasy. A moment later, Akani asked in surprise, You've advanced to the Fifth Order? Colin shivered slightly. Clearly, he did not expect the other party's senses to be so strong. Under normal circumstances, if a professional did not enter a combat state, it would be very difficult to see his strength attribute and rank. However, Colin had just advanced to the Fifth Order and was unable to control the holy light energy in his body. That was why some of it leaked out. He didn't expect Ajani to notice it. It seemed that this was not an archbishop who relied solely on his pretty face to reach his position. Yes, I was inspired by the mighty power of the God of Light last night and advanced. Colin had no intention of deliberately hiding his strength. Seeing that Ajani had already seen through it, he openly admitted it. For a moment, everyone in the meeting hall looked at Colin in a different light. A Fifth Order Knight. And such a young Fifth Order Knight. Many people even began to recall the holy knights in the history of the Empire of Light. When they were at Colin's age, they might not even have reached the Fifth Order. Ajani stared fixedly at Colin, waves of emotions surging in her heart. At this moment, she suddenly felt that she should make some changes to her previous plan. So what if I'm a Fifth Order Knight? In another 10 years, I can also become a Fifth Order Knight. Joyce's young voice broke the silence in the meeting hall. This little boy was clearly unable to accept that Colin had become the focus of everyone's attention. The acid in his stomach was about to overflow. Colin chuckled and nodded. Yes, young Master Joyce, you will definitely become a great knight of the northern frontier. Joyce nodded in satisfaction, and then tried to lead the conversation. Then, let's continue to discuss who killed Count Amon. Everyone present exchanged glances, but no one said a word. Even Archbishop Ajani remained silent, as if she had suddenly lost interest in the topic of winged knights. Seeing this, Colin coughed lightly, pointed at the dwarf's corpse, and said matter-of-factly, Isn't it a dwarf? Everyone was silent. To be honest, this method of framing was a little crude. Joyce furrowed his brows, and was about to speak when he heard a voice from outside the hall. Other than those dirty and despicable dwarves, who else could it be? Everyone looked towards the door, and saw Viscount Vala striding in. He first bowed to Joyce and then explained, Apologies, young Master Joyce. The reason I'm late is that I was discussing with my family's knight about avenging my father. Joyce was slightly shocked, and hurriedly comforted him. Viscount Vala, I can understand your feelings, but we still haven't determined who killed Count Amon. I hope you won't be rash. Young Master Joyce, I think you're overcomplicating things, Colin said loudly. A dwarf's corpse was found beside Count Amon's head, and there was indeed a dwarf warrior who fought with Knight Chester last night. Moreover, the dwarven army is approaching Coldwinter, and I'm afraid they want to assassinate an important person on our side before the battle starts, and disrupt our morale. So, with the corpse as evidence and the motive for the assassination, can't we confirm Count Oman's murderer under these circumstances? Viscount Angeli, there were 3 assassins last night and only one of them was a dwarf. Why are you so sure that the dwarves are the ones behind the assassination? Dragonden raised his eyebrows and retorted in a cold tone, Viscount Angeli, there were 3 assassins last night and one of them was a dwarf. Moreover, the dwarf's corpse was found under the ruins of the warehouse, and it's too obvious that it was planted. On the contrary, I feel that the mastermind behind Count Oman's murder isn't a dwarf at all. Colin chuckled and took a few steps forward, approaching Steward Doring. He asked in a low voice, then, who do you think is the mastermind? The aura of a grade 5 knight gradually spread out, and the air suddenly became stagnant. Steward Doring felt as if he was being stared at by an extremely dangerous beast. His entire body tensed up, and his heart raced, as if it would jump out of his chest in the next second. However, he gritted his teeth and did not take a step back. Steward Doring knew that Colin was deliberately putting pressure on him, but he definitely wouldn't dare to make a move. However, in the face of a real threat of death, Steward Doring still cowered. He didn't dare to voice his suspicions, and could only lower his head under Colin's sharp gaze. This requires further investigation. Colin didn't intend to let Doring off so easily. Steward Doring, with such irrefutable evidence before us, why are you defending the dwarves? What are you trying to do? Steward Doring wanted to explain. However, Colin didn't give him the chance and immediately cut him off. I'm beginning to suspect that you're a spy for the dwarves. Steward Doring's expression immediately changed, and he said angrily, Viscount Angeli, how can you? Viscount's Vala suddenly questioned, that's right, Steward Doring. Why are you always defending the dwarves? They're clearly a rebel force. An enemy. Steward Doring was really panicking this time, not because he was being framed by Colin, but because Vala Oman was actually speaking up for Colin. Colin's attitude was within his expectations, but Vala, as Count Almond's newly acknowledged son and first successor, Vala was actually helping Colin to accuse one of her own. Not only was Drinden dumbfounded by her betrayal, but Joyce, Akani, Lewis, and the others were also looking at her in surprise. They also realized the seriousness of the matter. If the Oman family sided with Vera, then, just as all kinds of thoughts flashed through everyone's minds, Colin directly made his move. He charged forward, and the knight's sword in his hand drew a silver light in the air. Blood splattered everywhere. When everyone came back to their senses, Steward Doring's head was already in Colin's hand. Colin, what are you doing? Joyce was so frightened that he kept retreating, screaming in shock. Colin smiled faintly, stabbed the knight's sword into the ground, and bowed slightly. Young Master Joyce, I'm just helping you get rid of a traitor from the house of St. Hilda. Traitor? What nonsense are you talking about? How can the old steward be a traitor? Colin said unhurriedly, that's right. Since I dared to kill him, I naturally have evidence. Chapter 265. Bang. Another coffin appeared in the meeting hall of the Lion's Roar Fort. The guard carrying the coffin reported loudly, Young Master Joyce, we found this corpse in Butler Dainton's room. Viscount Vala stepped forward to examine the coffin and said with a sorrowful expression, that's right, this is indeed my father's body. Framing. This is framing. Joyce shrieked, his little face full of anger and fear, you are framing the butler. Looking at Joyce who had lost his composure, Colin smiled faintly, Young Master Joyce, you can't slander an upright knight for no reason. Knight Lewis immediately stood up and questioned, if Butler Dainton really plotted to kill Count Oman, why would he deliberately hide the other party's corpse in his room? Colin seemed to be prepared as he explained unhurriedly, because he wanted to find something on Count Oman's body. What is it? The Duke of St. Hilda's will. Will. For a moment, Everyone cried out in shock. Knight Lewis also looked at Colin in bewilderment, various thoughts flashing through his mind. He did not dare to speak for a moment. The Duke of St. Hilda left behind a will? It seemed to be the first time Akani knew of the existence of this will, her beautiful eyes staring unblinkingly at Colin. Of course. Colin pointed at Viscount's Vala, indicating for her to explain. Viscount's Vala immediately took out a scroll of parchment and said in a deep voice, "I just found this will in my father's room. It was also this will that caused my father's death." With that, Viscount's Vala handed the will to Akani and said respectfully, "Your Eminence, please read the Duke's will." Akani took the parchment. Although she looked calm on the surface, her heart was in turmoil. Even if she had not read the contents of the will, she could already guess what was written in it. Seeing how fearless Colin and Vala were, this will definitely make Vera the heir. Moreover, Colin and Vala's performance just now made Akani realize a cruel fact. The Oman family was already on Vera's side. This was the most fatal. The Oman family's betrayal meant that Joyce's faction had completely lost control of Winter City. There was still the Golden Lion Legion loyal to Vera outside the city. Under such circumstances, even if the city defense was still in Joyce's faction, they would not be able to cause any trouble. That was why Colin dared to kill Butler Dankton in front of everyone and unscrupulously framed Butler Dankton. Once one had absolute power, one would have the right to speak. It was like a country holding a tube of detergent could claim that another country had weapons of mass destruction. What was important was not the authenticity of the evidence, but whether or not one had the ability to shut the doubters up. Now, Colin now. Akani's heart was heavy. She knew that she had to make a new choice. She slowly unfolded the parchment. Under everyone's expectant gaze, she opened her red lips and read aloud, "I, Cyril St. Hilda, as the 17th Dukes of the North, confer on Vera St. Hilda the title of Marquess of the Northern Frontier. After my death, she will inherit the position of Dukes of the North and wield the authority of the Northern Frontier. She will inherit the glory of St. Hilda." Impossible! This is impossible! Joyce's sharp and childish voice rang out again. There was no longer any arrogance in his voice. Instead, it was replaced by endless fear and anger. "I don't believe it. I am Father's first heir. How can Father let Vera inherit the position of Duke? Let me see, let me see." Joyce stretched out his trembling hand and asked to see the will with his own eyes. However, Akani ignored his request and said lightly, "This is indeed the handwriting of the Duke of St. Hilda. There is no problem with the badge." This represented the church's acknowledgement of the validity of the will. Colin smiled. This beautiful archbishop's ability to take advantage of the situation was very skillful. However, her understanding of the situation also saved him a lot of trouble. "Let me see, I want to see." Joyce was still shouting unrelentingly. However, Akani did not seem to hear his request at all. She kept the will and handed it back to Viscount's Vala. Viscount's Vala also ignored Joyce and kept the will close to her body. Joyce was completely ignored. The little boy's face turned red. His body began to tremble, and his eyes were filled with disbelief and fear. This young child had experienced the bitterness of the hypocrisy of the world prematurely. However, no one present had the time to care about the mental health of a child, especially after the child had lost the halo of being the Duke's heir. Viscount's Vala continued to explain, "Father told me that when he arrived at Winter Castle 3 days ago, Butler Dankton found him and showed him this will. However, the butler did not take out this will to execute it. Instead, he wanted to destroy it completely and help young Master Joyce ascend to the throne. Therefore, Father pretended to help the butler destroy this will, but in fact he secretly replaced it and hid the real will. Knight Lewis was also present at that time, and he can testify." Everyone's eyes instantly focused on Knight Lewis. At this moment, Knight Lewis also understood that the situation was hopeless. The Oman family's betrayal had made it impossible for Joyce to ascend to the throne. Moreover, the will was not destroyed. At this moment, Knight Lewis even suspected that Count Oman had been playing a spy all along. Could it be that the Oman family had always supported Vera? Had he been fooled from the beginning? Knight Lewis fell into deep fear and confusion. Faced with Vala's questioning, he hesitated for a moment before nodding and admitting the truth of the matter. With Knight Lewis's approval, Viscount Vala became more confident and continued to speak. The moment Father saw the Duke's will, he had already decided to support Miss Vera. However, Butler Dington insisted on helping young Master Joyce ascend to the throne. He even claimed that he had already united the various forces in the city to force Father to join them. Father had no choice but to pretend to agree. However, when Viscount Angley entered the city on behalf of Miss Vera, Father immediately formed an alliance with him and wanted to lead the family army out of the city to fight against the rebels with the Golden Lion Legion. However, Butler Dington saw this as a betrayal, so he secretly contacted the dwarves and arranged for an assassin to kill Father cruelly. After killing Father, Dington wanted to find the will on Father's body. That was why the assassin left Father's body and only took Father's head to leave Lion's Roar Fort to report back. However, what they did not know was that Father had been hiding this will in his room. After listening to Viscount Vala's story, everyone present fell into silence for a moment. It seemed that everything about Earl Amon's death had a reasonable explanation, but whether this explanation was the truth was not that important anymore. They all understood that Viscount Vala's story was just a high-sounding excuse. The real factor was Vera's crushing military strength. Therefore, when Viscount Vala decided to side with Vera, the situation in Winter City was already set. Butler Dington had to be a traitor, not because of the truth Viscount Vala just said, but because of the Oman family's army and the Golden Lion Legion outside the city. Colin coughed lightly and said righteously, Dington colluded with the rebels to murder Earl Aman. His crime is punishable by death. Does anyone have any objections? His gaze swept across the faces of everyone present. Joyce was already in a daze after such a huge blow. He stood there motionless as if he had lost his soul. Knight Lewis had already lowered his head. At this moment, he was only thinking about how to save his life. Knight Chester had always maintained a neutral stance, so he remained silent at this moment. As for Archbishop Ajani, after meeting Colin's gaze, she smiled and nodded. Yes, Viscount Angeli, I agree with what you did, Angeli said in a low voice. Colin also smiled with satisfaction. It is my honor to receive your recognition, Archbishop. However, I still hope that you can find someone to repair the church and not let the tragedy of Knight Thomas happen again. These words meant that Knight Thomas was indeed killed by the collapsed church. It was Colin's repayment for Ajani's change in stance. Ajani also understood the meaning behind Colin's words, and the smile on her face became even brighter. Colin's action of returning the favor made her understand that he was someone she was willing to cooperate with. In this case, it was acceptable for Vera to become a duchess. Viscount Angley, don't worry. We will definitely reinforce the church and not let such an accident happen again. Now, let's welcome Miss Vera into Winter City as soon as possible. As you wish. Chapter 266. Amidst the dull sound of gears turning, the gates of Winter City slowly opened. A messenger galloped out on a fast horse towards the Golden Lion Legion's camp outside the city. Not long after, the Golden Lion Legion began to assemble and slowly move towards the open gates. At the same time, the people in the Lion's Roar Castle had also arrived at the city gate to welcome them. Colin and Archbishop Ajani stood side by side in the front row of the welcoming team, while Joyce did not appear at all. The young third son of the Duke obviously could not bear the upheaval of falling from heaven, and he had already given up and gone into hiding. Of course, at this time, no one paid any attention to the third son of the Duke. Unless there was a miracle, he was destined to miss out on the position of Dukes of the North. Viscount Angley, Miss Vera has not been baptized yet, right? Ajani suddenly asked. Colin tilted his head slightly and looked at the beautiful archbishop who was bathed in the morning light. He smiled and said, if I remember correctly, the Lord's law does not explicitly state that only baptized knights can inherit the title, right? Of course not. Ajani smiled faintly, and her perfect side profile suddenly bloomed with a charming radiance. I just feel that as the future Dukes of the North, how can she not have the guidance of the God of Light? Colin turned his head and did not answer Ajani's words. Instead, he looked at the Golden Lion Legion that was slowly approaching the city. As a mage, if Vera accepted the baptism ceremony of the church, she would officially declare her conversion to the God of Light. This would definitely provoke the Yule Mage Council. However, if Vera did not accept the baptism, it would also bring a lot of trouble to her rule of the northern frontier. Of course, it was not difficult for ordinary mages and dukes of the north to make this choice. Colin had long been prepared to let Vera publicly convert to the God of Light after she succeeded the throne. Even if the Mage Council had any objections, they would not dare to do anything to a duke of the empire. Except for the lunatic Mr. Wong. However, according to Wizard Kudos, Mr. Chung was severely injured after releasing the trial's eye to kill the Duke of St. Hilda. He probably wouldn't be able to cause too much trouble in a short period of time. Furthermore, even if he wanted to cast the forbidden spell trial's eye again, it would be very difficult for him to find a city to sacrifice as easily as the first time. However, Colin was not prepared to agree to Archbishop Ajani's request so easily. Things that are too easy to obtain will not be cherished. Moreover, he was prepared to use this as a bargaining chip to extract more benefits from the church. Soon, Vera's figure appeared in front of everyone. She was riding a white horse and wearing a solemn black dress. Her face was also covered with a black silk scarf. Her expression was sorrowful and her eyes were downcast. Behind her was a carriage with the coffin of the Duke of St. Hilda on it, surrounded by 8 northern frontier knights. Colin and Ajani immediately led everyone forward to welcome her. After a round of greetings, Colin and Vera walked side by side at the front, escorting the coffin of the Duke of St. Hilda into chilly winter. A large number of citizens had already gathered on the streets of the city. Although there were rumors of the Duke's death in the city, the Lion's Roar Fort didn't express their stance, and the Duke's body was never seen. Therefore, the citizens of chilly winter were still doubtful of the authenticity of the news. But now, when the hearse slowly drove into chilly winter, the news of the Duke's death was confirmed. Chilly winter was instantly shrouded in grief and anger. The citizens on both sides of the street knelt on the ground. Some of them cried out loud, some prayed silently, and some had red eyes and were indignant. It had to be said that the Duke of St. Hilda was very important in the hearts of the lower-class citizens. He ruled the northern frontier for more than 30 years, killed a troll emperor, and was a powerful sacred knight. Even though he had been criticized for the invasion of the trolls and the famine in the past 2 years, in the hearts of the citizens of the northern frontier, especially the citizens of chilly winter, the Duke of St. Hilda was still the guarantee of peace and stability in the northern frontier. But now, this stabilizing figure had fallen. Panic and bewilderment shrouded the citizens of chilly winter, and they could only cry to vent their uneasiness. Amidst the cries of thousands of citizens, the hearse slowly drove into the Lion's Roar Fort. The Duke's body was temporarily placed in the backyard of the fort, waiting for a suitable burial date. Then, everyone returned to the meeting hall. The corpses had been removed, and the blood on the ground had been cleaned up. But the faint smell of blood still lingered in the air, reminding everyone that there had been an intense and cruel political battle here. Now that the loser had left dejectedly, the winner was still a little confused. Vera whispered to Colin, "Why didn't I see Joyce?" Colin shook his head slightly and said, maybe he wasn't feeling well, so he went back to rest. Vera seemed to understand something, and she no longer cared about her brother. Instead, she turned around and stood on the high platform in the meeting hall. She looked around and said loudly, "According to the information from the scouts, the Menham family and the Dawson family have joined forces and are heading towards chilly winter. They will arrive in 3 days. What do you think?" Faced with the question of the future dukes of the north, everyone turned to look at Colin at the same time. Obviously, everyone knew who would be in charge of the northern frontier in the future. Colin said, "I think we should first defend the city and wait for the rebel army's morale to drop. Then, we will find an opportunity to take the initiative to attack." Akani frowned and asked, "Viscount Angley, didn't you think we should take the initiative to leave the city and fight to the death with the rebel army? Why are you making such a conservative strategy now? This is not in line with your heroic image as a northern frontier knight." Colin pursed his lips slightly, wondering if the Archbishop really did not understand military affairs or if he had other motives. Your Excellency, I'm not afraid of war. I just feel that we shouldn't let the soldiers of the northern frontier make unnecessary sacrifices. Since we have a strong city like Chilly Winter as a barrier, why should we give up our advantage and fight the rebel army? Akani glanced at the silent Viscount Vala and spoke again. You're right. Viscount Angley, I'm not doubting your strategy, but I feel that the dwarf rebel army has humiliated us and even sent an assassin to kill Earl Amon. With such hatred, if we hide in the city, won't some of the soldiers be dissatisfied? Before Colin could respond, Viscount Vala spoke first. Don't worry, Your Excellency. Don't worry, Archbishop. Although the soldiers of the Oman family want nothing more than to avenge my father, we will definitely follow Miss Vera's orders. A look of surprise appeared on Akani's face. She really couldn't understand why this son of Earl Oman would be so cooperative with Colin, completely unaffected by her provocation. After this round of probing, Akani knew that there was nothing she could do. Vera and Colin had complete control of Chilly Winter, and no one could influence their decisions. Although the city defense army was still in the hands of Knight Lewis, it was impossible to change the situation with that little military strength. Furthermore, this knight, who was not very firm in his stance, might have decided to completely rely on Vera. Akani did not say anything else when she thought of this. Colin scanned the room and saw that no one had any objections. He could not help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Then he spoke again in a clear voice. Please, everyone rest assured. I have already sent a letter back to Icestone City and ordered Knight Syar to lead the Black Cavalry down south. They will probably reach Chilly Winter in a few days. Moreover, Duke Modwin of the Half-Elven Kingdom will also lead the Silver Moon Guard down south to attack the dwarf rebel army. When they arrive, it will be the best time for us to take the initiative and quell the rebellion at the northern frontier. Colin's words finally caused the eyes of everyone in the meeting hall to light up. It was only now that they realized that the Angeli family actually had a fresh army in Icestone City. At this time, no one raised any objections to Colin's strategy. Moreover, their confidence in quelling the rebellion at the northern frontier was unprecedentedly high. Vera and Colin exchanged glances and then announced proudly, "Let's go. Everyone, the peace and stability of the Empire's northern frontier requires your protection. I swear in the name of the holy ancestors of the House of St. Hilda that I will go through thick and thin with you. The storm will eventually pass, and evil will be defeated. May the God of Light grant us courage and bear witness to our dedication." The young girl's clear and powerful voice echoed in the meeting room, and she already had the aura of a ruler of the northern frontier. Colin immediately knelt down on one knee and responded loudly, "For the northern frontier." Then, all the knights in the hall knelt down and saluted. Archbishop Akani's eyes flashed, and she finally bent down and bowed to Vera. "For the northern frontier." Chapter 267. Time passed, and it was already June. The short spring in the northern frontier was coming to an end, and the smell of summer was approaching. But before the arrival of summer, Winter Castle welcomed the dwarf army. The combined forces of the Menham family and the Dawson family had a total of 150,000 soldiers, and they had arrived at Winter Castle. The army came in a meandering manner. Their banners were bright, and their weapons were in great numbers. They were orderly, and their morale was high. At a glance, they were undoubtedly a strong army. The elites of the dwarf clan had basically gathered here. When the army arrived, they surrounded Winter Castle and started to set up camp. It was as though they were preparing for a long-term attack. In the temporary command post of the dwarf army, the atmosphere was quiet and solemn. Marquis Menham was praying devoutly. This Marquis Menham was a devout believer of the Radiant Lord. On the surface, he was very devout. As a vassal race of the humans, the dwarves had long abandoned their beliefs and chose to serve the Radiant Lord. But it was a pity that the dwarves were unable to become knights. It was unknown whether it was because they weren't sincere enough or because they couldn't cross the racial gap. From this point, there was an unresolvable gap between the dwarves and the humans. It was said that the believers of Mother Earth, the deity that the dwarves once served, were secretly spreading their beliefs. Of course, as dwarven nobles, they had to convert to the Radiant Lord. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a place for them in the Radiant Empire. After finishing his prayer, Markymanhem lifted his head and scanned the command post. Although the last princess of the dwarven royal family, the Selinsky family, had married into the Dawson family, in reality, the Menham family was the true leader of the dwarves, whether it was in terms of military strength or prestige among the dwarves. However, not all dwarven nobles recognized the leadership of the Menham family. At least, the Dawson family didn't. They had always thought that they were the inheritors of the Serinsky family and that the blood of the dwarf king flowed in their veins. Thus, Marquis Dawson didn't like Marquis Menham. He felt that Marquis Menham's prayer was too fake. Chilly Winterfell is right in front of us. How should we conquer this northern frontier's central city? Do you have any suggestions? Marquis Menham said in a deep voice with the authority of a superior. At this moment, he also considered himself to be the commander of the dwarven army. Although Marquis Dawson was not convinced, he had just suffered a great defeat at the Rapids River. His reputation was severely damaged, and his military strength was far inferior to Marquis Menham's. Therefore, he was unable to snatch the command of the allied army from Marquis Menham. A dwarven general with bulky limbs spoke. Menham, I believe there is no city in the world that our dwarven army cannot conquer. Even Winter Castle was the same. So, once the engineering team has finished building the siege weapons, we can launch the attack. Let's see how long this so-called strongest city on the northern frontier can last. The dwarf general had a hoarse voice, and his tone was bloodthirsty. He didn't think highly of chilly Winter Castle. In fact, the dwarves were very experienced in siege warfare. Their craftsmen were very good at building siege weapons. Moreover, their short stature was an advantage in siege warfare as they wouldn't be easily hit by the rain of arrows. Therefore, compared to fighting in the wilderness, the dwarves were more proficient in siege warfare. Of course, not all the dwarven generals present were so frivolous. Another dwarven general stood out and cautiously expressed his opinion. I don't think we can be careless. I've entered chilly Winterfell before. I know how sturdy the walls are and how ingenious the design is. If we attack forcefully, we'll have to pay a heavy price. I think so too, Marquis Dawson, who had been silent, suddenly said. Marquis Menham frowned slightly. His eyes were fixed on Marquis Dawson as if he was waiting for a further explanation. Marquis Dawson looked calm as he said, as a noble of the northern frontier, I've studied the defense system of chilly Winterfell. First, this is a Winterfell built on a high mountain. If we want to attack, we have to attack from above. The enemy has the high ground and has the advantage of terrain. Secondly, the walls of chilly Winterfell are made of the hardest rock, which has been carefully cut and piled up. They are 5 meters thick, and our siege hammers won't be able to shake them. Moreover, the walls of chilly Winterfell are double-layered. Behind the outer wall is an inner wall. The distance between the two walls is 20 meters, and there are 96 towers. Even if we break through the two walls, don't forget that there's still the Lion's Roar fort at the top of the mountain. If we want to attack by force, I'm afraid we'll have to send in all the elite warriors of the dwarf race. As soon as Marquis Dawson's voice faded, a general of the Menham family shouted, Sir Marquis Dawson, the war hasn't even started yet. Why are you boasting for the enemy? Are you afraid? I just don't want some people to die in vain. Enough. Stop arguing. Marquis Menham waved his hand and dissuaded them. After everyone quietened down, Marquis Menham said to Marquis Dawson, since you don't want to attack, do you have a better suggestion? Marquis Dawson stroked his big beard and said calmly, I think the best method is to surround the Winterfell without attacking. But Marquis Menham asked again. The famine at the northern frontier is fierce. Even the House of St. Hilda didn't have enough time to stock up on rations. Moreover, I've investigated and found out that chilly Winterfell is suffering from a shortage of rations. As long as we surround the Winterfell and cut off all connections, it won't be long before the Winterfell falls due to the shortage of rations. That will be our best chance. Marquis Menham's eyes flickered, and he was tempted. While he was pondering over Marky Dawson's suggestion, he saw a tall and thin figure walk into the command post. Marky Minam's eyes focused as he recognized the person. "Mr. Grimm, is that you?" The person was covered in a large magician's robe, and his face was hidden in a hood. It was unknown how he walked into the command post of the Dwarven army. "It's me," Mr. Grimm answered succinctly. His voice was gloomy and hoarse, as though he was an old man who had one foot in the grave. Minam smelled a strong rotting stench, like the stench of a corpse that had been left for a long time. "Are you all right?" Marquis Minam asked carefully. Mr. Grimm didn't answer the question. He said calmly, "Two things. First, the Black Cavalry and Silvermoon Guard of Icestone City have set off and are heading towards chilly Winterfell. You have to be careful of your backs. Second, the Oman family's army is in chilly Winterfell. Earl Oman and Viscount Angley have a grudge against each other. You can use this to sow discord between them and weaken chilly Winterfell." Mr. Grimm suddenly stopped talking. The dwarves looked at each other, not knowing what had happened. Finally, Marquis Minam asked, "Mr. Grimm? Mr. Grimm?" Mr. Grimm didn't speak, as though he was stuck. He was like a wooden sculpture that stood motionless on the spot. Marquis Minam was puzzled. He took a few steps forward to check on Mr. Grimm. After taking a few steps, Marquis Minam stopped, and his eyes were filled with astonishment. When Marquis Dawson saw this, he was confused. Suddenly, he felt a holy and majestic power enveloping this world. He felt as though he was an insect trapped in amber, completely locked down by this irresistible power and unable to move at all. After an unknown period of time, Mr. Grimm sighed and regained his ability to move. Then he slowly turned around and walked out of the command post. The dwarven soldiers outside were also rooted to the spot, as if time had been completely frozen for them. In front of Mr. Grimm stood a proud and aloof figure. It was just a figure, but it emitted a dazzling radiance that made everything else in the world pale in comparison. Mr. Grimm slowly took off his hood, revealing a terrifying face. The left side of his face had completely rotted, and his black skull could be seen. The right side of his face was infected as well. Green veins popped out like wriggling maggots as though they were about to explode. But Mr. Shue seemed to be oblivious to the terrifying changes in his body. He greeted the man with a normal expression. He looked at the dwarven soldier and said, "Prince Rich, I didn't expect to see you here." Chapter 268. "You're so ugly." Prince Lexi turned around and spoke mercilessly to Mr. Lexi the moment he saw him. Mr. Lexi opened his rotting mouth and laughed silently. He did not seem angry and replied, "I'm a fallen person. Of course, I can't compare to you, who is bathed in the glory of the God of Light." Prince Lexi was indeed elegant, handsome, and elegant. Although he was close to 50 years old, he looked like he was only 27 or 28 years old due to his meticulous maintenance and the power of the paladin. His eyes were deep and melancholy, but there was always a faint smile on his lips. He exuded an irresistible charm. But under this charm, there was an extreme danger. As the only living paladin of the San Lorenzo family, Prince Lexi could be said to be the Empire of Light's greatest weapon. Countless enemies of the Empire had died in his hands. There was even a saying in the Empire of Light: the Empire could do without Emperor Reinhardt, but it could not do without Prince Lexi. This saying was actually harsh, but the fact that it could be spread also reflected Prince Lexi's status and prestige in the Empire. However, this paladin of the San Lorenzo family seemed to be on an excursion and did not have a trace of killing intent. He had a faint smile on his face and asked Mr. Lexi, "I heard that you have researched a new forbidden spell called Trial's Eye, and you used it to kill Cyril St. Hilda?" "Yes." Mr. Lexi nodded and stared at Prince Lexi with his remaining right eye, as if he was afraid that the other party would suddenly disappear. "Impressive," Prince Lexi praised with a smile, but then he changed the topic and his tone became somewhat sarcastic. "But how did you end up like this? Didn't you say that this new forbidden spell only requires the sacrifice of a city and the caster will not have to pay the price?" Mr. Lexi's ugly face showed a hint of bitterness and he sighed. After all, it was an experimental forbidden spell. It was also my first time casting it, so there were some miscalculations. Sorry for making a fool of myself. Oh? Where did you make a mistake? Prince Lexi asked with interest. The two of them were like-minded friends who were exchanging their knowledge of spells. It should be because the number of people sacrificed was not enough, so I suffered some backlash from the forbidden spell. Really? Fallen Eagle City has over 300,000 residents, isn't that enough? Prince Lacey was shocked and asked, then how much is enough? I'm afraid we'll have to sacrifice 500,000 people, Mr. Chong said calmly, as if 500,000 people were no different from 50 lambs in his eyes. Prince Archwise smiled, as if he felt sorry for Mr. Phone. 500,000 people. Such a large city can be counted on one's fingers within the Radiance Empire. Yes. Mr. Chong also seemed to find it a pity. Sacrificing these large cities is easier said than done. Furthermore, once the news of Fallen Eagle City spreads, I'm afraid that the defenses of these large cities will be strengthened. Us mages will have even less of a chance. I remember that there are more than 500,000 residents in Yevil, right? Prince Rhy seemed to be trying to help Mr. Chu think of a solution. That's right. Mr. Kuei nodded in agreement when he saw that the other party was encouraging him to sacrifice his mage city. He seemed to really think that this idea was feasible. But then, he shook his head and said, there is no second chance in life. We have to pay the price for our past mistakes, but it is also this price that gives us the opportunity to grow. Prince Artwai smiled even more brightly. Well said. Mr. Chong, if I had known you earlier, perhaps we could have become friends. It is my great honor to be your highness friend. Mr. Chong bowed solemnly. Actually, it is not too late to start being friends now. No, it is already too late. Prince Rhy shook his head slowly. The smile on his face gradually disappeared, and his tone became cold. I am here to kill you today. Hearing that a paladin wanted to kill him, Mr. Chang's face was expressionless. Of course, it could also be that his festering face could no longer make any expression. May I ask, why do you want to kill me? Mr. Chang's tone was still as calm as water, as if he was not nervous at all. Why ask when you already know the answer? Prince Rhy's gaze gradually turned cold. When Emperor Reinhardt watched as you stirred up trouble in the northern frontier, I found it strange. And when the Menham family sent their army north, trying to take advantage of the chaos in the northern frontier to establish a kingdom for the dwarves, I confirmed that there was a deal between you and Emperor Reinhardt. Then, what did you use to move my good nephew, to make him stand by and do nothing to help his wife's family, and instead secretly help a family that has a blood feud with the San Lorenzo family? When the news of Fallen Eagle City being burned and the Duke of St. Hilda being killed by a forbidden spell reached my ears, I finally understood. You gave this Trials Ite casting scroll to my good nephew in exchange for his support, right? Mr. Chang did not say anything, tacitly agreeing with Prince Rhy's judgment. At their position, it was very boring to lie forcefully. Prince Rhy sneered. Mr. Chang, when you were trying to curry favor with His Majesty and handed this forbidden spell to him, did you ever think that you would become the public enemy of the Holy Knights because of this? Mr. Chang still did not say anything. His remaining right eye looked straight ahead, but his pupils were a little unfocused, as if, was he distracted? Prince Rhy narrowed his eyes, as if he was angered by Mr. Chang's attitude. The air was filled with an extremely dense murderous aura, as if a landslide was going to happen in the next second. Your Highness. Mr. Chang finally came back to his senses and said calmly, of course, I can understand if you want to kill me. But before that, can you allow me to say a few words in defense? A cold smile appeared on Prince Lacey's face. What? You still want to convince me not to kill you? Mr. Chang nodded. Yes, I want to try. Prince Rhy immediately retracted his murderous aura and elegantly raised his hand to make an inviting gesture. All right, I look forward to your performance. If you can make a determined holy knight change his decision, perhaps your eloquence will be above your arcane skills. Mr. Chang coughed lightly and said unhurriedly, Your Highness, you see my current condition. Your Highness, you've seen my current situation. Due to a miscalculation, I've suffered a backlash from a portion of the forbidden spell. I don't think I'll be able to live much longer. Why do you have to dirty your hands? Prince Rhy was unmoved, clearly dissatisfied with Mr. Chang's reasoning. Mr. Chang was not discouraged and spoke again. Your Highness, since I can give the scroll of trials I to Emperor Reinhardt, of course I can give one to someone else. If you kill me, aren't you afraid that my mage friend will avenge me? Prince Rhy sneered and said disdainfully, if your mage friend saw your pitiful state, would he still be willing to cast this forbidden spell? Even if he was willing to sacrifice his life for you, why would he sacrifice a city of more than 300,000 people? After the incident at Fallen Eagle City, which lord isn't on guard against you mages? Or is he prepared to burn Yevil to avenge you? Why not? Mr. Chang's expression was calm, but his gaze was firm. Perhaps you don't understand what this forbidden spell means to a mage. What does it mean? Prince Rhy asked with a smile. It means that we have finally found a glimmer of hope to break free from the shackles on our bodies and wield the power of the sacred domain. After saying this, Mr. Chang's bent back instantly straightened, and his only remaining eye revealed a fanatical glow. Prince Rhy's expression gradually changed, and endless killing intent spread out from his body, causing the space to become stagnant. Mr. Chang tried to persuade him again, Your Highness, do you really want to gamble? But I still want to remind you that our wager is not worth it. My life is worthless, but you are the pillar of the Empire of Light. Prince Rhy's gaze was cold, and he seemed to have made up his mind. Mr. Chang, you're mistaken about something. What is it? Mr. Chang was puzzled. You shouldn't have tried to threaten a paladin, Prince Rhy said firmly. In the face of threats, never retreat. This is the belief that a paladin should have. Mr. Chang sighed and smiled bitterly. Looks like I've made another mistake. The sword at Prince Rhy's waist was unsheathed, and the air seemed to have become sharp at this moment. It doesn't matter, just be careful in your next life. Mr. Chang seemed to have accepted his fate. He looked at Prince Rhy calmly and said, Before I die, can I have one last request? Speak. Mr. Chang raised the magic staff inlaid with a fiery ruby in front of him and said in a clear voice, I want to see your strongest attack. Chapter 269. My strongest attack? Prince Rhy was enveloped in a blinding holy light. At this moment he seemed to be more dazzling than the sun in the sky. Yes. Mr. Chang closed his only eye, as if he could no longer bear the gaze of his opponent. But his expression was solemn, his back was straight, and his hands were even waving his staff, as if he was preparing some kind of spell. Good. Prince Rhy agreed to Mr. Chang's last request. You are worthy of this attack. As soon as he finished speaking, Prince Rhy's eyes turned completely dark gold. Mysterious and complicated golden patterns crawled all over his face, as if he was wearing a golden mask. The knight's sword was erected in the air in front of him, and the tip of the sword suddenly exploded with a whirlpool of holy light. In an instant, countless golden threads gathered at the whirlpool, as if something terrifying was surging out from within. This sword is called Judgment. Prince Rhy spoke. His voice did not have a trace of human emotion, as if he was a god that was about to destroy the world. But he did not swing his sword, because he realized that Mr. Chang was not waiting for his death, but was also preparing his own spell. The air became hot and dry, and the temperature rose by more than 10 degrees. Mr. Chang's hands turned red, and even made a buzzing sound, as if he was holding on to something extremely hot. The huge ruby inlaid at the top of the staff actually had fine cracks on it. Bang! In the next second, the ruby completely shattered, and countless threads suddenly exploded. A blinding red light slowly rose in front of Mr. Chang. In order to release this spell, Mr. Chang seemed to be draining his life. His face was rotting at a speed visible to the naked eye, and in the blink of an eye, there was not a single piece of intact flesh on his face. His originally straight back bent down again, as if some kind of heavy burden was weighing down on his shoulders. His gray mage robe was already stained red with blood, and it was obvious that Mr. Chang's body was rapidly disintegrating. But he was still stubbornly chanting the Elvish language, as if he was going to completely burn his life to release this spell. Prince Rhy silently watched his opponent, but the long sword in his hand did not strike. He was waiting for Mr. Chang's spell to be completed. In fact, if a mage were to fight a knight one-on-one, the mage would naturally be at a disadvantage. This was because the greater the power of a mage's spell, the more complicated the preparation work needed to be done. On the other hand, knights had already integrated the power of holy light into their bodies and could unleash great power with just a wave of their hands. Like now, Prince Rhy could kill him 1,000 times over before the spell was complete. But strangely, Prince Rhy did not make a move. It was as if he was deliberately waiting for Mr. Jean to complete the spell. Then he crushed it with his sword. This was the pride of a paladin. It was Prince Lacey's conceit. Even though the spell that Mr. Chong was preparing might be a forbidden spell, Prince Rhy seemed to be prepared to wait. He wanted to see just how beautiful the final song of this respectable opponent would be at the last moment of his life. Boom! Balls of purple flames suddenly rose up and surrounded Mr. Chong. At this moment, Mr. Feng was almost a skeleton. His flesh and blood were rapidly melting away in the demonic purple fire. On his head, his left eye was empty, while his remaining right eye suddenly emitted a beam of green light. Bang! The green light exploded. His only right eye had also disappeared. But Mr. Chang's indifferent voice was heard. Mohasakadura. Prince Rhy was stunned. Previously, Mr. Chang's spell was in Elvish, so he could understand most of it. But now, it was actually Kunya. This was the special language of the High Elves, but it had been lost for thousands of years. A whirlpool of purple flames suddenly appeared in front of Mr. Chang's chest. It seemed to reflect another world. Prince Rhy felt a strong sense of threat. Ever since he became a paladin, he had never felt such a threat. Destroy! Prince Rhy did not hesitate and slowly swung the knight sword in his hand. The speed of his sword was extremely slow, but the world seemed to have slowed down. The wind stopped. The flames stopped dancing, and even Mr. Chang's thoughts suddenly froze at this moment. A golden shadow seemed to have transcended the constraints of space and time. It instantly appeared in front of Mr. Chong, slowly tearing apart the whirlpool of purple flames in front of him and crashing into his chest. Bang! It was as if something had shattered. Mr. Chang's body instantly stiffened, and he completely stopped moving. It's over. Prince Rhy sighed in disappointment and was about to withdraw his long sword. But at this moment, the demonic purple flames that were gradually extinguishing suddenly reignited. Boom! The purple flames climbed up Mr. Chang's body and instantly engulfed him. Prince Rhy narrowed his eyes and stared closely at the strange phenomenon in front of him. His heart was filled with shock and vigilance. Holy light gathered at the tip of his sword again. The huge energy seemed to distort the surrounding space. Judgment. Prince Rhy swung his sword again. The golden sword light sank into the purple flames. It seemed to have become fuel, causing the purple flames to surge even more fiercely. Interesting. Prince Rhy's aura suddenly rose. His expression became extremely sincere and determined. Golden patterns instantly crawled all over his body. My heart is the Holy Spirit. My heart is the light. When my heart is fearless, the light can illuminate everything. The prayer seemed to have caused some kind of resonance between heaven and earth. Behind Prince Lacey, a huge shadow slowly gathered. Whoosh! Behind the silhouette, 4 pairs of huge golden wings suddenly spread out, enveloping the entire area within. Judgment of light. A grand and indifferent voice seemed to have come from the shadow behind Prince R. In an instant, light enveloped everything. But when the light reached the extreme, it became darkness. Everyone in the camp only felt a darkness that seemed to have surged out from the depths of their souls and drowned their consciousness. They could not see, hear, or feel anything. But Prince Rhy could still see. He saw that the demonic purple flames were instantly extinguished under the light. But the next moment, it reignited again. And it burned even more fiercely. A crack gradually appeared where Mr. Chang's shattered heart was. The crack suddenly opened and swallowed the purple flames. At this moment, Prince Archwai saw that there seemed to be another world hidden behind the crack. It was a boundless green ocean. The surface of the ocean burned with purple flames that seemed to never be extinguished. In the sky above the purple flames, a huge green eye hung high up in the sky. Prince Archwai looked at the huge green eye and felt that it was extremely familiar. A grand and distant voice came from that strange world. When the final judgment arrives, the punished will fall into hell, and the blessed will be reborn. The crack suddenly closed up. That strange world completely disappeared, as if it had never appeared. Mr. Chang's body suddenly lost its support and collapsed like a building whose foundation was destroyed. Prince Archwai's face was solemn. The knight's sword in his hand was still unsheathed, but he could not feel Mr. Chang's aura. Prince Archwai slowly approached and found that Mr. Chang did not have any signs of life. His flesh and blood had completely disappeared, leaving behind only a withered skeleton. But strangely, Mr. Chang's bones had all turned into stone. Prince Archwai stepped on Mr. Chang's head and crushed it. It was really stone. Prince Lacy stood there in shock and bewilderment for a long time. He did not know what kind of spell Mr. Chang had released, and why it was so strange, but it did not have any offensive power. It was as if Mr. Chang did not burn his life force to counterattack. And Prince Archwai felt that he had been used by the other party. The 3 slashes he made seemed to have become part of the other party's spell? Impossible. Immediately, Prince Archwai shook his head. He felt that this idea was too ridiculous. But that world of purple flames made this holy knight feel uneasy. That huge green eyeball. After pondering for a long time, Prince Archwai finally sheathed his sword. A light breeze blew past, and the camp returned to normal. Prince Archwai's figure was nowhere to be seen. Only the shattered stones and the gray mage robe were left. Is he gone? In the temporary command post, Marquis Dawson asked with lingering fear. He should be gone. Marquis Minam said softly, as if he was afraid of alarming that terrifying existence. Mr. Chang was killed? Should be. In the command post, there was silence again. A group of dwarf nobles lowered their heads, as if thinking about the future of their race. After a long time, Marquis Minam finally stood up and walked out with a heavy expression. Marquis Dawson and the others looked at each other and quickly followed. Chapter 270. Looking at the rubble on the ground, Marquis Minam's face twitched slightly. He suddenly understood that the phrase obliterated wasn't an exaggeration. Cough, cough. Collect Mr. Kai's corpse and bury it. Yes. Then Marquis Minam turned to look at Marquis Dawson and asked seriously, what do we do next? What do you think? Marquis Dawson shrugged his shoulders and said helplessly, Mr. Kai is dead, so there's no need to attack Winter Castle. Indeed, the dwarves attacked Winter Castle with the hope of pushing Mr. Kai to the position of Dukes of the North so that the dwarves could establish their kingdom on the northern frontier. But now, Mr. Kai was obliterated, so there was no need to attack. Even if they conquered Winter Castle, would the dwarves dare to occupy the position of Lord of the Northern Frontier? Marquis Minam sighed and looked worried as he asked, what about the establishment of the kingdom? The establishment of the kingdom can be discussed with the House of St. Hilda, Marquis Dawson said in a deep voice, but his tone was lacking in confidence. Will St. Hilda agree? Marquis Minam stroked his beard and looked anxious. We have to try. Marquis Dawson wasn't confident either. Yes, weren't you discussing with the dungeon lords of the northern frontier about the relocation of their territories? How many families agreed? Besides the Angeli family, almost all of them agreed. The situation at the northern frontier was deteriorating, and these families were eager to escape. That's much easier. Marquis Dawson became excited again. You can continue with the relocation of territories. As for the Angeli family, if they don't agree, don't force them. You can find other nearby families. In short, the Menham family will move to the northern frontier. Then, we'll join forces and use peace talks to force the House of St. Hilda to agree to the establishment of the kingdom. If that doesn't work, we can ask Emperor Reinhardt for help. Didn't Emperor Reinhardt promise you? Marquis Minam pondered for a long time before he finally made up his mind. All right, Let's test the house of St. Hilda's attitude. With that, he beckoned to a young dwarf beside him. Enka, go to Winter City and see what's going on there. Yes, father. Huayu City. Wind and clouds suddenly surged in the sky above the Phoenix Butterfly Castle. Then, a huge green eye suddenly appeared in the clouds. He suddenly opened his eyes. Time seemed to have stopped for a second before everything returned to normal. Everyone from the Phoenix Butterfly Castle raised their heads in a daze, yet they couldn't see anything unusual. It was as if the pressure that caused one's heart to palpitate was just an illusion. Father! Count Morrison ran into the room sweating profusely, his words full of unconcealable panic. Knight Franco was sitting in a wheelchair, quietly looking at the sea of tulips outside the window, lost in thought. Seeing that Franco did not respond, Count Morrison whispered again, "Father?" After a long time, Franco opened his mouth and said, "Don't ask too much about things that you can't understand or grasp." Count Morrison could only nod and suppress the doubts in his heart. Franco stopped talking and looked deeply in the direction of the bell tower in the distance. At the top of the bell tower, the ancient bell that had experienced 100 years of wind and rain had unknowingly stopped turning. In the cave below the bell tower, a figure wearing a red mage robe was standing beside the blood pool. His body was rather large, but he had a severe hunchback. His limbs were also abnormally thick. His face was rough, his cheekbones protruding, his mouth was crooked, and his eyes were one big and one small. He looked very ugly. However, this malformed red-robed mage was currently emitting a terrifying aura that caused one's heart to palpitate. Low murmurs that sounded like sleep talk constantly came from the red-robed mage's mouth. The voice seemed to get louder and louder, causing the entire underground cave to shake. Ripples spread out from the center of the blood pool, stirring along with the red-robed mage's hand gestures. The fine ripples gradually became violent, and finally, they set off waves of blood. In the spiderweb above the blood pool, the living people in the cocoons seemed to have been stimulated by something and immediately began to struggle madly. Boom! The waves of blood surged and engulfed the spiderweb. When the blood pool regained its tranquility, the cocoons were all empty, and the living people inside had completely disappeared. The red-robed mage stopped casting and stared fixedly at the center of the blood pool, as if waiting for something to appear there. After an unknown amount of time, a figure slowly emerged from the blood pool. When the viscous blood slowly slid down, the face of the figure could finally be seen clearly. It was the Duke of St. Hilda. The Duke of St. Hilda, who had been petrified, actually recovered from his petrified state at this moment. Then he opened his eyes. For a moment, it was as if lightning flashed in the cave, and it was as if a red sun had fallen into it. The red-robed mage seemed to be unable to bear the light and had no choice but to close his eyes. "Ah, we did it, Pa." The red-robed mage laughed loudly. He was extremely excited and even a little deranged. He let out an incomprehensible roar from his mouth and waved his arms and legs wildly, venting the joy in his heart. After a moment, the light dissipated. The red-robed mage also gradually recovered from his madness. He opened his eyes again and revealed an ugly smile to the Duke of St. Hilda, who had come back from the dead. "Mr. Chi, we did it." The Duke of St. Hilda also revealed a smile and said, "Horace, we did it." His smile was a little strange, as if he was still unable to perfectly control the muscles on his face, and his speech was not very clear. However, this scene made one's hair stand on end. Mr. Chi, who should have been killed by Prince Lehigh, had instead used the corpse of the Duke of St. Hilda to come back from the dead. "How does the Holy Knight's body feel?" the red-robed mage, Horace, asked anxiously. He looked at the body of the Duke of St. Hilda, his eyes full of envy. The Duke of St. Hilda, no, it should be Mr. Chi, stretched this body. He faced the sky, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes in enjoyment. He said with a satisfied expression, as expected of the strongest individual of the human race, the Holy Knight. "I can feel that this body is filled with explosive power. Moreover, this is the feeling of breaking free from the shackles." Then Mr. Chi raised his right hand, and a red light flashed in his eyes. He did not seem to be chanting any spells, but a ball of purple fire rose from his hand. The purple fire danced continuously, and a boundless pressure filled the underground cavern. Even the blood pool became turbulent once again. "Be careful, don't collapse this place," Horace shouted loudly. Then he pointed at Mr. Chi's body, and reminded him, "Don't collapse this holy knight's body, which was obtained with great difficulty." Mr. Chi retracted his spell and looked down. He saw that there were small cracks on his new body, and golden blood was seeping out from them. It was a horrifying sight. But the most horrifying thing was the terrifying scar on the Duke of St. Hilda's chest that almost split him in two. Mr. Chi knew that this was the wound that the Holy Knight of the Troll Empire, Prince Otto, had left on the Duke of St. Hilda. After this torment, this wound had become even more serious, as if it would completely collapse in the next moment. Mr. Chi smiled faintly, and did not panic. "It seems that the first thing we need to do is to repair this body." Horace stroked his chin and frowned. "This is really troublesome. It will require a lot of precious materials, and it will probably take 2 to 3 years. Mr. Chi was not in a hurry. He smiled and said, "Then let's take it slow." "Take it slow?" Horace said in surprise. "After 2 to 3 years, who knows what the northern frontier will be like? Your House of St. Thean has planned for so long, and you're giving up just like that?" Mr. Chi chuckled and shook his head. "When I sacrificed the entire fallen Eagle City, I was already destined to have no fate with the Dukes of the North. The people of the northern frontier will never accept a demon, a madman, as their ruler." Horace seemed to have understood something and said, "So, this resurrection plan was not your last resort at all. Instead, it was your real goal from the very beginning." Mr. Chi nodded. "That's right. From the beginning, I did not expect to use this method to seize the northern frontier. The House of St. Thean has been in exile for more than 300 years. Without their own army and vassal knights, they would not be able to secure their position as the ruler of the northern frontier. So, my true goal has always been this holy knight's body. Only by occupying this body can I break through the limits of the Saint Realm." Horace's expression changed slightly, and he said in a low voice, "Aren't you afraid that something will go wrong with the forbidden spell you developed? I admit that Trial's Eye and Final Judgment, these two interrelated forbidden spells, are indeed genius ideas. However, they are new forbidden spells that have just been developed. If something goes wrong, won't you?" Mr. Chi looked indifferent, and said faintly, "If I don't even dare to take this risk, how can I resist the false god?" Horace was silent. Seeing this, Mr. Chi spoke again. "Are you afraid?" Horace raised his eyebrows and laughed loudly. "What am I afraid of? You even dared to try such a dangerous forbidden spell? Of course I won't back down." "Good." Mr. Chi nodded with satisfaction, his eyes deep. "The shackles that have been binding us mages for thousands of years, it's time to completely smash them." Horace's ugly face was flushed with excitement, and he was about to howl for this exciting and grand goal when Mr. Chi suddenly took out a ball-shaped object and threw it over, saying, "Go to Imperial Dragon City and give this to Emperor Reinhardt." "What is this?" Horace looked at the eyeball in his hand and asked with a puzzled expression. "This is a gift I give to my allies," Mr. Chi said with a smile full of meaning. "It is also the first step of our rebellion plan." Chapter 271. The majestic lion's roar castle looked even more desolate under the afterglow of the setting sun. Colin and Vera were standing side by side on the balcony of the main castle as they enjoyed the beautiful scenery of the sunset. Vera was wearing a palace-style strapless dress today, revealing her round shoulders and slender neck. Her long blonde hair was tied up casually, and her fair and smooth skin made people want to kiss her. The afterglow of the setting sun outlined her perfect side profile, and Colin was a little entranced. "What are you looking at?" Vera turned her head and smiled at her husband. "I am looking at the future Dukes of the North," Colin teased with a smile. Vera rolled her eyes cutely and said with a slightly worried tone, "There is still a rebellion in the northern frontier. Moreover, I don't know if the Emperor and the Senate will agree to let me inherit the title of Duke." Colin was about to comfort his wife when he heard footsteps behind him. Immediately, the new butler of the house of St. Hilda, came to the balcony and bowed to report. Miss, Viscount Angley, the messenger of the dwarf has arrived. Vera slowly turned around and nodded. Good. Ask him to come in. Colin also turned around and saw a familiar dwarf walking in. Dear Miss Vera, Viscount Angley, Anka, the son of Marquis Menem. I would like to extend my most sincere greetings to you. When Colin heard the dwarf's name and self-introduction, he suddenly remembered that he had met Count Anka in Icestone City. When he had just returned from the Troll Empire, he had met the dwarf count at the triumphant return banquet. The dwarf count had also proposed to exchange part of the Menham family's territory in the Flaming Flame territory for the Angeli family's territory. Count Anka, please have a seat. Vera returned the greeting and then invited the dwarf to sit at a small round table on the balcony. The maid brought coffee and desserts at the right time. Colin also sat down at the table, sipped his coffee, and asked with a smile, Count Anka, did you come this time for the matter of the territory exchange? Count Anka paused for a moment, then shook his head awkwardly. That's not it. Furthermore, the transfer of territory requires mutual consent. If you are not willing, the Menham family will not force you. Colin raised his eyebrows, a little surprised by Count Anka's weak attitude. Back in Icestone City, this dwarven count was quite arrogant. One moment, he said that he wouldn't let the Angeli family suffer any losses. The next moment, he said that the Menham family's army was about to arrive at the northern frontier. He almost forced Colin's hand to sign. There had to be a reason for Count Anka's change in attitude. Could it be that the dwarves felt that they couldn't conquer Chilly Winter Castle and were prepared to negotiate? Why did you come to Chilly Winter Castle? Count Anka glanced at Vera and saw that she was silently sipping her coffee and eating her desserts. She didn't seem interested in this conversation. This attitude made Count Anka understand that Viscount Angley was the true owner of Chilly Winter Castle. Miss Vera, Viscount Angley, I came this time to reach a peace agreement with you and put an end to the chaos at the northern frontier. Peace agreement? Colin raised his eyebrows and looked seriously at Count Anka. The dwarves actually wanted to negotiate. Colin started to plan in his heart. Actually, at this moment, Colin was wavering between war and peace. Initially, Scholar Dwayne's plan was indeed a wise and prudent one. However, after severely weakening the Dawson family at the Rapid Flow River and defeating the Oman family's army in Cold Winter, Colin had the confidence to fight against the dwarven army. That was why he wrote a letter to Icestone City and asked the main forces of the Black Cavalry and the Silver Moon Guard to rush over. However, he didn't expect that just as he was about to fight to the death with the dwarves would suddenly cower. This made Colin feel as though he had punched the air. Tell me your conditions. Colin decided to observe the situation first. Count Anka was energized and immediately said, Your Excellency Viscounts, the Menham family has no intention of becoming enemies with the House of St. Hilda. We are also very willing to see a peaceful northern frontier. Therefore, as long as you agree to our request to establish an independent kingdom, the dwarven army outside the city will immediately retreat. The House of St. Hilda will also obtain the eternal friendship and gratitude of the dwarves. Colin stroked his chin. He wasn't surprised by this condition. Wasn't this group of dwarves causing trouble with Mr. Roland for such a long time for this goal? However, why would they give up on the St. Thean family and turn to cooperate with the House of St. Hilda? Colin immediately realized that something must have happened in the other party's camp. Otherwise, the dwarves wouldn't have planned to negotiate for peace without even trying to attack the city. You want to establish an independent kingdom on the northern frontier? Yes. What about the territory? Count Anka was already prepared. When he heard this, he immediately took out a map from his bosom and spread it out on the table, introducing it. Miss Vera, Viscount Angley, please take a look. This is the territory of the Dwarven Kingdom in our plan. It includes the current territory of the Dawson family, the Lamba family, and the Billy family. Please rest assured, other than the Dawson family, the other leaders of the northern frontier have all agreed to exchange territories with the Menham family. Wait. Colin immediately interrupted Count Anka and asked, Agreed? Who agreed to exchange territories with the Menham family? Count Anka's heart skipped a beat, and he said carefully, Viscount Angli, these leaders have all agreed. Moreover, we have obtained great Emperor Reinhardt's permission. Colin wasn't moved. He said coldly, what about the House of St. Hilda? Have you forgotten who is the leader of the northern frontier? Count Anka smiled apologetically and said, that's why I came to chilly winter. I want to obtain the approval of the House of St. Hilda. Vera didn't even lift her head when she heard this. She didn't seem interested in Count Anka's suggestion. Colin placed his coffee cup on the table heavily and said in an unfriendly tone, Count Anka, the Menham family has just arrived at the northern frontier, and you're preparing to take away such a large territory to establish an independent kingdom. I'm afraid you don't care about the House of St. Hilda. The corners of Count Anka's mouth twitched, as if he was suppressing the anger in his heart. However, he still forced a smile and defended himself. How can that be? The Menham family has always respected the House of St. Hilda. This time, we have obtained great Emperor Reinhardt's permission to establish our kingdom. After establishing our kingdom, the Dwarf Kingdom will be the eternal partner of the House of St. Hilda. Partner? Colin smiled coldly. But the House of St. Hilda doesn't need partners like you. If you were a vassal, I would consider it. How about this? If the Menham family swears allegiance to the House of St. Hilda, the northern frontier will allow you to settle down there. Count Anka's face turned gloomy. He seemed to have lost his patience with Colin. Therefore, he turned to Vera and asked directly, Miss Vera, is this also your intention? Vera lifted her head and looked at Count Anka calmly. She nodded seriously and said, this is my intention. This is also the will of the House of St. Hilda. Count Anka was finally enraged. He stood up immediately and said loudly, I came here with good intentions, but I did not expect to receive such strong hostility. Miss Vera, Viscount Angli, I understand what you mean. I will definitely inform my father and let him make the decision. Thank you for your hospitality. Goodbye. After he finished speaking, Count Anka bowed perfunctorily and left with large strides. Colin frowned as he looked at Count Anka's back. He said to Vera, who was beside him, I think that something must have happened to the dwarves. Otherwise, they would not have come to negotiate with us so early. Their attitude was also very low. I deliberately provoked them a few times before they finally left. Vera laughed and patted Colin's arm. She smiled and said, I also thought that it was strange. Are they really the dwarves who are famous for their bad temper? They actually tolerated you for so long. It seems that the other party is really anxious to negotiate with us. Colin stretched his body and said leisurely, whatever the enemy wants to do, we cannot let them succeed so easily. So, there's no need to rush. If they are really sincere about negotiating with us, they will come again. Vera thought for a moment before she said, I think that the change in the dwarves' side may be related to the arcane fluctuation that I detected this morning. Colin's heart skipped a beat. Then, have you figured out what happened this morning outside the city? It was too far away, so I do not know what it was. Vera shook her head. Then, she suggested, maybe we can ask our teacher. Mage Kudos? Colin thought for a moment before he nodded. Okay, I will go and see if he knows anything. Chapter 272. When Colin found Wizard Cusius, he was playing with a canary. He was relaxed and carefree, just like a retired old man. This sixth-rank wizard had been following Colin and the others ever since they'd coincidentally met, but he had also been acting like a bystander. Although the other party had confessed his relationship with Mr. Cusius and even handed over a Trial's Eye casting scroll, Colin was still wary of Cusius. Now that the situation in the northern frontier was gradually improving, Colin was ready to have a showdown with this person. He couldn't just leave this unknown friend or foe by his side and not deal with him, right? Good evening, Mr. Cusius. You are in a good mood. Good evening, Viscount Angli. Cusius turned around and invited Colin to take a seat. After some small talk, Cusius went straight to the point. Sir Viscounts, are you here because of the arcane energy waves outside the city this morning? Colin nodded and asked, That's right. Do you know what's going on? Cusius shook his head. My apologies, Sir Viscounts. I am actually very curious about what happened outside the city, but I was so far away. I only know that someone released an extremely powerful spell, but I can't guess anything else. Colin was slightly disappointed, but he immediately asked, extremely powerful? How powerful? Could it be a forbidden spell? It is possible. However, Sir Viscounts, the release of a forbidden spell is not that simple. A trace of struggle appeared on Cusius' face, but it was quickly replaced by determination. You must be very curious as to why I abandoned Mr. Cusius and turned to the house of St. Hilda. Colin was slightly stunned, obviously not expecting the other party to take the initiative to expose this layer of window paper. Although Colin had suspected that Cusius was involved in Mr. Cusius' plan to sacrifice Fallen Eagle City, he did not point it out because of his identity as Vera's teacher. He did not expect Cusius to take the initiative to admit it now. I'm a little curious, Colin said casually. Wizard Cusius looked seriously into Colin's eyes and said honestly, Sir Viscounts, before I came to you, I met Mr. Feng once. Colin did not speak, quietly waiting for Wizard Kudos to continue. At that time, Mr. Chang's condition was very bad. Colin's curiosity was piqued. He asked, how bad? He lost his left eye, but that was part of the plan, because that was the price he had to pay to release the Trial's eye. But when I saw him, the entire left side of his face had been completely corroded. Moreover, even though he tried to hide it, I could still sense the aura of death around him. So, I immediately realized that Mr. Kue was still suffering from the backlash of the forbidden spell. The sacrifice of Fallen Eagle City was not enough to completely eliminate the backlash of the forbidden spell. He messed it up. Colin's eyes flashed, as if he had understood something. So, that's why you handed over the Trial's eye casting scroll so readily. You realized that compared to other forbidden spells, this forbidden spell did not have a qualitative improvement, and it still required the caster to pay a terrible price. Cusius nodded, but then shook his head. Mr. Cusius' state at that time really surprised me, but if you say that the Trial's eye did not have a qualitative improvement, then you are underestimating Mr. Cusius. You must know that to be able to kill a holy knight, Trial's eye is already a true 8th rank forbidden spell. If a forbidden spell of this level were to be cast using normal methods, I'm afraid that 7 or 8 6th rank mages would have to work together to cast it, sacrificing their own lives. But for Mr. Cusius to be able to cast the spell with his own strength and not die on the spot, this is already a great success. Hearing this, Colin laughed coldly and retorted, his own strength? Have you forgotten the 300,000 citizens of Fallen Eagle City? Cusius' expression was somewhat awkward. He coughed lightly and immediately apologized. My apologies, Lord Viscounts, I did not intentionally leave out those innocent lives, it's just that. Cough cough. From an academic point of view, the forbidden spell that Mr. Cusius researched is indeed an extremely important breakthrough. The coldness in Colin's eyes did not decrease in the slightest. Cusius' perfunctory attitude made him understand that he was just like Mr. Cusius, a demon without a bottom line in his heart. If the Trial's eye really did not have a negative effect on the caster, this guy would definitely not hesitate to use it when he had the chance. However, although he had already sentenced Cusius to death in his heart, on the surface, Colin did not continue to pester him. Seeing this, Cusius relaxed. Perhaps in his eyes, those lowly commoners were no more than insignificant ants in the eyes of a noble like Colin. Thus, Cusius continued, if you understand Mr. Cusius, you will understand that he is definitely an arcane genius. That year, he became a 6th-level mage at the age of 27, directly creating a historical record in Yevil. However, because mages are unable to become saints, Mr. Cusius also faced a desperate situation where he had nowhere to go. Thus, he began to research various forbidden spells, which led to the creation of the Trial's eye, which could be said to have changed the course of arcane history. Colin looked at the fanatical Cusius and laughed coldly in his heart. Yes, Mr. Cusius had created the sacrificial forbidden spell. However, whether this was a path to glory or a prelude to depravity for mages, that was hard to say. Cusius continued. Even if there were some mistakes, it was actually unavoidable. After all, this was the first time such a brand new forbidden spell was released, but this has already opened up a new path of arcane research that is full of hope. Since you admire Mr. Cusius so much, why did you betray him? Colin interrupted the other party's flattery. Cusius smiled bitterly, because I feel that Mr. Cusius' fate will be very tragic. Firstly, he himself suffered from the backlash of the forbidden spell, and does not know how long he can live. Cusius hesitated, but in the end he still spoke. On the day of the sacrificial ritual in Fallen Eagle City, I was actually outside the city. Mr. Cusius asked me to help him block any possible disturbances. At that time, I was rather curious as to who Mr. Cusius was guarding against. Later, I found out that the chairman of the Yevil Mage Council, Mage Ernest, had actually appeared outside Fallen Eagle City. Obviously, someone had informed Ernest of Mr. Cusius' plan, and this person is most likely Emperor Reinhardt. Colin listened quietly, without any expression. Cusius continued, I'm guessing that Emperor Reinhardt is actually quite wary of Mr. Chong. Since he obtained the Trial's Eye casting scroll and verified its effectiveness, Mr. Chong shouldn't be of much use to him. Therefore, although he is bound by his promise and will not personally send people to kill Mr. Cusius, it is very likely that he will reveal Mr. Cusius' whereabouts to others. Due to the terrifying power of the Trial's Eye, there must be many people who want to kill Mr. Cusius. For example, Ernest, Prince R. Outside Fallen Eagle City, I helped Mr. Cusius block Ernest, but Prince R.H. Haha, I don't think Mr. Cusius can escape his pursuit. Colin's eyes flashed, and he said, You think that the arcane spell explosion this morning could be caused by Prince R.H.'s arrival? There is such a possibility. Cusius shrugged, The last time we met, I also asked Mr. Cusius if he had a way to deal with Prince R.H.'s pursuit. But he did not say anything. Either he does not trust me enough, or he himself has not thought of a way to deal with it. No matter what the situation is, I feel that there is no need for me to follow him down this path to the end. Seeing that Colin was deep in thought, Cusius coughed lightly, and said with a slightly flattering tone, Viscount Angley, I have already told you everything I know. Please believe me, when I assisted Mr. Cusius, it was only to understand the true effects of the Trial's Eye forbidden spell. It was purely academic research, and I had no other intentions. Even at that time, I did not know that Mr. Cusius' target was actually the Duke of St. Hilda. Colin glanced at Cusius, not knowing if he believed his nonsense. Cusius was a little nervous, but he continued, With my relationship with Vera, of course, I would not deliberately harm the Duke of St. Hilda. If I had known that Mr. Cusius' target was the Duke of St. Hilda, I would have stopped him with all my might. Cough cough. I am also very sorry about the death of the Duke. So, to make up for it, I am willing to become the magic consultant of the House of St. Hilda. Colin sneered in his heart. This guy probably saw that the situation at the northern frontier was gradually becoming clearer, and that the House of St. Hilda was not in danger of collapsing, so he shamelessly came forward to become a magic consultant. However, this was probably the best way out for Cusius at the moment. First, he offended the chairman of the Mage Council, Ernest. Then, when he saw that the future of Mr. Cusius' side was bleak, he had no choice but to completely turn to the House of St. Hilda. I will pass on your request to Vera. Colin suppressed the disgust in his heart and smiled perfunctorily. After that, the two of them chatted briefly before Colin took his leave. Walking along the dim corridor, Colin suddenly smelled a familiar fragrance. After turning a corner, Colin suddenly realized that Archbishop Ajani was walking towards him. Good evening, Viscount Angley. Ajani smiled sweetly, like 100 flowers blooming together. Good evening, Your Excellency. Colin felt that the scene now was somewhat familiar. 2 days ago, they seemed to have met like this by chance. I just received a piece of good news. Would you like to hear it? Ajani slowly walked towards Colin. Under the dim light, her beautiful face flickered between light and darkness, exuding a fatal charm. What good news? Tell me about it. Colin stopped in his tracks. But Ajani was still getting closer and closer. The fragrance of the roses became stronger and stronger, drilling straight into the depths of Colin's heart. Finally, Ajani stood less than half a meter away from Colin. She raised her head slightly, and her watery peach blossom eyes stared fixedly at Colin. Her red lips opened slightly, and a piece of news shook Colin's heart. Mr. Cusius is dead. Chapter 273. How did he die? Although Colin had already guessed this possibility, he still couldn't help but be greatly shocked when the news really came out from Ajani's mouth. Prince Rhy killed him? Akani stared into Colin's eyes, as if trying to find something. This morning, in the dwarf army's camp outside the city. As expected, Colin looked calm on the surface, but in his heart he was in a state of shock. Prince Rhy, a holy knight at his peak, was indeed terrifying. He entered an army of tens of thousands and killed a level 6 wizard as easily as crushing an ant. No wonder Emperor Reinhardt was so wary of this prince, to the extent that he was willing to betray his wife's family to obtain a bargaining chip that could keep him in check. However, Prince Rhy's response was domineering. He found Mr. Rhy and killed him without hesitation. This was probably a warning to Emperor Reinhardt. However, to the House of St. Hilda, Prince Rhy was a great help. With Mr. Rhy dead, the northern frontier could no longer be overturned. Apart from Mr. Rhy, the House of St. Thean did not have any other outstanding figures. With the fall of this pillar, even if there were still some powerful figures, they would probably be so scared that they would go into hiding, not daring to show their faces again. Without the House of St. Thean, the rebellion at the northern frontier would lose its source. Even though the Dawson and Menham families were still entrenched outside Winter Castle, they could no longer shake the foundations of the House of St. Hilda. The dukes of the Empire's 4 territories were all from Holy Knight families. There had never been an exception. If the dwarves wanted to be an exception, their fate would be extremely miserable. They were now thinking of how to persuade the House of St. Hilda to allow the dwarves to establish their own country. It was no wonder that the dwarven messenger, Count Anka, was so humble. Moreover, Colin was even more certain that even if they didn't come to an agreement, the dwarves would send another messenger. The initiative was now back in the hands of the House of St. Hilda. Viscount Angley, what are you thinking about? Colin came back to his senses and saw that Ajani was looking at him with bright eyes, her deep blue eyes full of probing. I'm thinking about how to deal with the remaining rebels. Have you made up your mind? Colin smiled and asked, Your Excellency, how do you think we should deal with those dwarven rebels? Akani's expression was indifferent, a dreamy color floating in her beautiful big eyes. She piously said, The God of Light appreciates forgiveness, but he also values punishment. Forgiveness earns praise, punishment earns awe. Colin smiled, understanding Akani's meaning. In fact, this archbishop had been encouraging the House of St. Hilda to fight to the death with the dwarven army from the very beginning. When Earl Oman controlled Winter Castle, she had the same attitude. Do you have some grudges with the dwarves? Colin asked with a smile. Ajani shook her head and said, I have no prejudice against dwarves. However, I do not wish to see the establishment of the dwarven kingdom. Akani did not answer directly this time, but asked, Your Excellency Viscounts, are you willing to see the dwarves establish an independent kingdom on the northern frontier? Of course I am not willing, because this is the northern frontier. Whether it is as the lord of the northern frontier or as Vera's husband, I have reasons to oppose any attempt to divide the northern frontier. But what is your reason? In the face of Colin's doubts, Akani's eyes flashed and she said softly, As the Archbishop of the Northern Frontier Diocese, I certainly do not wish to see the northern frontier divided. I see. Colin nodded slowly, understanding Akani's motive. Then we are allies. Of course. Akani nodded, once again blooming with a perfect smile. Colin's mouth was dry, but he quickly calmed himself down and maintained his vigilance. He asked again, What's the matter? He asked again, then, as an ally, should I also do my part to prevent the dwarves from establishing an independent kingdom? The smile on Akani's face became even more brilliant, coupled with the strong holy aura around her body, she appeared even more charming. Your Excellency Viscounts, How do you want me to do my part? Colin took a deep breath, his nose filled with the strong scent of a mature woman. You were able to find out about Prince Leahy killing Mr. Roland so quickly because you have spies in the Dwarven army, right? Akani was slightly stunned, but she quickly regained her composure and said lightly, "The God of Light has loyal believers in every corner of the world. This should be considered as an admission." However, Colin was indeed quite impressed by the Church of Light's ability to gather information. He had experienced it once in Icestone City because of Vera. He did not expect that they would also have fanatics in the Dwarven army who would inform the church. This pervasive method of infiltration was indeed unsolvable. Especially among the dwarves, this was even more rare. Although the dwarves had always believed in the God of Light had not given them the glory they deserved. They could not be baptized into knights. Therefore, the proportion of fanatics among the dwarves was definitely not high. But even so, the Dwarven army outside the city was like taking off their clothes in front of the church, with no secrets to speak of. "I need to borrow this loyal believer of yours," Colin suggested with a smile. Akani looked hesitant and said, "What do you want to do? You must know that this believer has already taken a great risk in order to pass on information to the church. I cannot let him be sacrificed so casually." It was not that he could not be sacrificed, but that he could not be sacrificed casually. Colin understood what she meant. She was worried that his method was not reliable. "Please rest assured, of course I will not let a loyal believer of the God of Light die." "Then what is your plan?" Colin smiled and suddenly leaned close to Akani's ear. The beautiful archbishop was shocked. Just as she was about to back away, she heard Colin whispering in her ear and immediately froze on the spot. However, her small and delicate ears were turning pink at a speed visible to the naked eye. Colin laughed coldly in his heart. "Who asked you to keep provoking me? Now it's my turn to fight back." Moreover, this archbishop who had always maintained a pure and pious attitude was not really as calm as still water, without a trace of mortal desires. After explaining his plan, Colin once again pulled away from the two of them, and gave the rosy Akani what he thought was the most gentlemanly smile. But in Akani's eyes, this smile was especially hateful. Akani seemed to be angry at her loss of composure just now, and glared fiercely at Colin. However, she didn't know how alluring this glance was. "How confident are you that you can succeed?" Colin crossed his arms and smiled confidently. "Since I dare to make such a suggestion, I naturally have enough confidence." "Your Excellency Archbishop, do you not have confidence in me?" Akani stared at Colin for a moment, and finally nodded. "Of course I have confidence in you." Good. Colin stretched out his hand, "To a happy cooperation." "To a happy cooperation." Akani did not hesitate, and stretched out her hand to shake Colin's. The warm and soft touch made Colin's heart beat faster. Unfortunately, Akani only shook Colin's hand lightly, and then immediately withdrew her delicate hand. Colin was disappointed, and when he saw that the other party was about to turn and leave, he opened his mouth again. "By the way, Your Excellency Archbishop, the Duke's body has been delayed for too long. Vera and I hope that you can hold his funeral as soon as possible." Akani immediately stopped in her tracks, her large blue eyes staring at Colin once more. When the Duke's body had just entered the city, she had already felt that something was wrong. Moreover, she had also heard from Earl Amon that the Duke's body had been swapped, so Colin's intention was very obvious. This was because he was worried that the problem with the body would be discovered, and he wanted to bury the body as soon as possible, so that the news of the Duke's death could be concluded. Colin did not seem to be guilty, and looked at Akani openly, as if he did not have any selfish motives, and only hoped that the Duke of St. Hilda could be buried as soon as possible. Finally, a smile bloomed on Akani's pretty face again, and she nodded. "After dealing with the dwarf rebels, I will hold the funeral for the Duke of St. Hilda." Chapter 274. As Colin expected, the next day, the dwarves sent a messenger to Winter Castle. It was an old acquaintance, Earl Anka. Both times, the Menham family came to Winter Castle to negotiate. This showed that Marquis Dawson had been marginalized in the dwarf army. This time, Vera and Colin met Earl Anka in the greenhouse. Of course, the one who led the negotiations was Colin. Vera was concentrating on the blood rose that she had recently planted. "Viscount Angley, I have conveyed Miss Vera and your intentions to my father. My father understands your concerns. However, please believe that the dwarves have no intention of becoming enemies with the House of St. Hilda. However, our will to establish an independent country is equally firm. In order to make up for the losses at the northern frontier, my father is willing to give up a portion of his territory." Earl Anka took out a map of the northern frontier and showed it to Colin. "From the Rapids River to the Poplar Forest, we are willing to unconditionally transfer the territory to the House of St. Hilda. In addition, the Dwarf Kingdom will sign an alliance treaty with the northern frontier. As long as the Duke of St. Hilda orders, the dwarves will send troops to assist. Moreover, the Menham family will pay 1.5 million gold coins to the House of St. Hilda every year. Viscount Angley, this is the annual tax that a marquis pays to his lord. Therefore, besides not swearing allegiance to the House of St. Hilda, the Menham family has fulfilled the obligations of a vassal of the northern frontier. You can even consider the Dwarf Kingdom as a part of the northern frontier, and the dwarves are still citizens of the northern frontier." Colin rubbed his chin and was deep in thought. In order to reach an agreement with the House of St. Hilda, the Menham family had made a lot of concessions. However, Colin was still not satisfied. Whether it was the so-called alliance agreement, the annual tribute, or even the ceding of territory, nothing could change the fact that the dwarves wanted to divide the northern frontier. As long as the dwarf king did not swear allegiance to the Duke of St. Hilda, the House of St. Hilda would have no binding power over the dwarves, and the dwarf kingdom would remain a separatist force. These conditions are not enough. Colin shook his head coldly. Count Anka pursed his lips and asked patiently, "What other conditions do you want? We can discuss them." Colin said calmly, "I want the Dwarf King to accept the title conferred by the Duke of St. Hilda and swear allegiance to the Duke of St. Hilda." "This is impossible." Count Anka refused without hesitation. "The Dwarf King will only swear loyalty to Emperor Reinhardt." Colin shrugged and spread his hands. "Then there's nothing to discuss." Count Anka resisted the urge to beat up Colin. He took a few deep breaths and said in a low voice, "Viscount Angley, we dwarves came with goodwill, but we did not expect you to trample on our goodwill. You have to know that we dwarves have been waiting for thousands of years to build a kingdom. Please do not underestimate our determination. Also, do not think that we dwarves will only compromise. Our weapons are still sharp, and our warriors still thirst for blood." Colin looked quietly at Count Anka, who was on the verge of exploding. He suddenly smiled and said, "Is Mr. Kerr dead?" Count Anka was stunned. His big round eyes rolled a few times before he nodded helplessly and said, "Yes. Prince Rhy had killed Mr. Kerr in public, so it was impossible to hide it." Count Anka also knew that Winter City would find out about this sooner or later. But he did not expect it to be so fast. The Menham family was so eager to negotiate because they wanted to conclude the negotiations before the news of Mr. Kerr's death reached the House of St. Hilda. Unfortunately, they were still too late. Count Anka sighed inwardly. He finally understood why Colin was so unyielding. Colin saw that Count Anka's expression was gradually turning gloomy. He smiled as he took the map of the northern frontier and drew a new circle on it. "I can agree to the dwarves building a kingdom, but the territory you agreed to cede is far from enough. I want this land." Count Anka hurriedly looked over, but then he frowned and said hesitantly, "Viscount Angley, the land you drew is the Marquis territory of the Dawson family, right?" Colin had a matter-of-fact look on his face. Count Anka narrowed his eyes and shook his head. "This is impossible. The Dawson family will not agree to such conditions." Colin chuckled. "But the one negotiating with me now is not the Dawson family." Count Anka finally understood what Colin meant. He was instigating the Menham family to betray their ally. The dwarf count lowered his head and did not speak. He was struggling internally. Seeing this, Colin opened his mouth again. "Fran Dawson betrayed Marquis Garcia and the Black Cavalry. The House of St. Hilda will not forgive such hatred. So, If you want to reach an agreement with us, you have to hand over Marquis Dawson. Furthermore, I believe that the dwarf race must be deeply ashamed of such a traitor. Could it be that the Menham family is prepared to build a kingdom of dwarves with such a person? Oh, right, I also heard that Marquis Dawson claimed to be the successor of the former dwarf king Selinsky. Could it be that you are prepared to push him to the position of dwarf king? What right does he have to be the dwarf king? Count Anka said with disdain. Colin smiled proudly. Then what are you hesitating for? Count Anka was silent for a while before he spoke again. If we hand over Marquis Dawson and give up the Margit, the House of St. Hilda will agree to the Menham family building a kingdom of dwarves? That's right. Colin nodded seriously. Count Anka seemed to be a little worried, and he turned to look at Vera. Vera also turned around and said in a low voice, "Yes, Count Anka, these are our conditions. Marquis Dawson must pay the price for his betrayal." Count Anka calmed down a little, but he did not dare to agree to such conditions. However, his reaction did not seem to be too resistant. After all, they had betrayed the Dawson family, and the Menham family's interests were not harmed. Instead, they had one less competitor. Seeing this, Colin had an idea. He opened a piece of parchment, wrote down the contents of the agreement, and handed it to Count Anka. "You can take this agreement back and show it to Marquis Menham. If he agrees, you can sign it." Count Anka put away the parchment, nodded, and left in a hurry. In the greenhouse, Vera put down the potted plants in her hands and asked worriedly, "Do you think that Marquis Menham will agree to such conditions?" Colin smiled and said, "Whether he agrees or not, I have a way to deal with it." Vera was relieved. She had almost blind faith in Colin. After all, no matter what problems they faced, Colin always had a way to solve them. "I hope that father can personally execute Marquis Dawson." Vera gritted her teeth and said angrily. The father she was talking about was, of course, Marquis Garcia. Of course, no problem. After the dwarves are dealt with, it is almost time to exchange prisoners with the eastern region. You should be able to see Marquis Garcia again very soon. Okay. Vera fiddled with the rose petals in front of her, and her heart was filled with thoughts of her father. Today, Vera was wearing a milky white tube-top pleated skirt, and her bright blonde hair was tied up with many naughty twirls at the end of her hair. The girl used a red hairband to hold her hair in place. Colin stepped forward and hugged Vera in his arms. He did not say anything, but he just gently stroked his wife's back. Vera also hugged Colin's waist and buried her face in his warm chest. Both of them did not say anything, and they quietly enjoyed this sweet and warm moment. On the other side, Count Anka hurriedly returned to the dwarven camp outside the city. "Father, this is the condition of the House of St. Hilda." Count Anka handed the agreement to Marquis Menham and said in a low voice, "They want Marquis Dawson." Menham stared at the parchment in his hand, and his expression changed rapidly. Finally, he said, "What a clumsy trick." Count Anka was taken aback, clearly not expecting such a reaction from his father. After a while, he mumbled. After a while, he said, "Father, what do you mean? It is not impossible to hand Marquis Dawson over to the House of St. Hilda." "Idiot!" Marquis Menham scolded. "If we really sell Marquis Dawson, the dwarven army will immediately fall apart, and the Menham family will become the shame of the dwarves. When that time comes, we will lose the support of the Dawson family. Will we be able to deal with the House of St. Hilda alone?" When Count Anka heard this, he suddenly felt a chill in his heart, and cold sweat appeared on his forehead. He stuttered, Then, what should we do?" Marquis Menham's eyes flashed, and he said decisively, "Follow me to see Marquis Dawson." Chapter 275. Deep into the night, the dwarven camp was quiet and solemn. "Father, it's so late and you haven't rested yet?" Marquis Dawson raised his head and saw his second son, Wales Dawson, walk in. Wales had a fair face and didn't have the nose of the dwarves. His beard was also well-groomed. If it wasn't for the fact that he wasn't tall due to his race, he would be considered a handsome young man with a graceful bearing. "It's so late. What are you doing here?" Marquis Dawson furrowed his brows. Marquis Dawson didn't like his second son. He felt that he was too spoiled and didn't have the valiance and tenacity of the dwarves. He was only obsessed with women. Fortunately, Marquis Dawson's eldest son wasn't bad and could inherit the family business. Therefore, Marquis Dawson didn't care about his second son. Wales was a little afraid of his father. He carefully moved closer and said mysteriously, "Father, I just received a shocking piece of news." "What news?" Marquis Dawson didn't care and buried his head in the pile of documents. Wales was a little depressed at his father's perfunctory attitude. He knew that he wasn't valued by his father, but he was unwilling to accept it. Now, he felt that his chance to turn things around was here. "Father, this is news that can determine the survival of the Dawson family." "Speak." Marquis Dawson was a little impatient. Wales' face flashed with a trace of resentment and he said in a low voice, "Father, I heard that Marquis Menam is preparing to give you to the House of St. Hilda in exchange for their agreement to establish the dwarves." The quill in Marquis Dawson's hand finally stopped. He raised his head and looked at his second son with a burning gaze and asked in a deep voice, "Where did you hear this news?" Wales avoided his gaze and said hesitantly, "Father, shouldn't you be worried about the betrayal of the Menam family first?" Marquis Dawson glared and shouted angrily, "Less nonsense. Answer my question." "It's Archbishop Ajani who sent someone to inform me." "How did she inform you? Why did she inform you?" I. Looking at his father's increasingly ferocious gaze, Wales was so scared that he was tongue-tied and couldn't speak. "Idiot." Marquis Dawson's hair and beard fluttered, making him look like an exposed lion. He kicked Wales to the ground and pounced on him. He grabbed his collar and asked fiercely, "What are you doing? Are you secretly contacting people from the church? Am I right?" Wales nodded while trembling. Then, his father punched him until he had a panda eye. Wales screamed exaggeratedly. His voice even attracted the guards on duty outside the tent. However, after seeing that it was a scene of a father beating his son, the guard quietly slipped out again, as if he was already used to it. "Father, don't hit me," Wales cried. "I really didn't betray any military secrets. There really isn't." Marquis Dawson didn't believe such nonsense. He knew his son very well. As he beat him, he scolded him. "Brainless idiot. How many times have I told you that Agiani is a beautiful snake that eats people? You actually dared to secretly court her at this time. Who is she? Is this something you, a dwarf without the right to inherit a title, can hope for? She's just using you. Using you." After a long while, Marquis Dawson seemed to be tired of beating his son and stopped. Wales was paralyzed on the ground, half dead. He screamed weakly from time to time. "Speak." Marquis Dawson kicked his son again. "What did she say to you?" Wales hugged his bruised body and suddenly felt very wronged. "You didn't let me contact Agiani, so why do you want to know what she said to me?" Of course, Wales only dared to criticize in his heart. She said, "The Menham family has already reached an agreement with the House of St. Hilda. As long as you are handed over, the House of St. Hilda will agree to the peace talks and allow the dwarves to build a kingdom on the northern frontier." Marquis Dawson didn't seem to be worried about his situation at all. Instead, he asked, "Why did Agiani tell you this?" "Father, the situation in chilly Winter City is very tense now. Although on the surface, Vera and Colin seem to have the upper hand with the help of the Golden Lion Legion. In fact, Master Joyce also has a lot of supporters. These supporters of course don't want to see Vera solve the rebellion on the northern frontier smoothly and inherit the title of Duke. Archbishop Agiani is one of Master Joyce's supporters." Marquis Dawson looked at his son expressionlessly and asked, "So she wants to destroy the peace talks?" Wales nodded. "She hopes to join hands with the Dawson family. This is a letter she wrote to you personally." As he spoke, he took out a letter and handed it to Marquis Dawson. Marquis Dawson didn't read the letter. Instead, he continued to look at Wales with cold eyes and asked, "Did you tell the church about our situation here?" Wales wanted to shake his head, but when he saw his father's sharp eyes, he could only stutter and say, "Yes, I did say some, but it's not any military secrets, I swear." "What did you say?" Marquis Dawson's eyes became colder and colder. I only told them that Prince Rhy killed Mr. Dawson. That's all. There were so many witnesses. Even if I didn't say anything, the church would find out sooner or later. Marquis Dawson sighed in his heart. His son was really too stupid. He actually revealed such crucial information to the church. It was no wonder that the Menham family's emissary was obstructed when he wanted to negotiate. This was because the other party knew that the dwarves' most important bargaining chip was gone. However, it seemed that the Menham family would really betray the Dawson family in order to reach an agreement with the House of St. Hilda. While Marquis Dawson was deep in thought, Wales was still rambling on to defend himself. Father, actually, Archbishop Agiani is a trustworthy person. The relationship between me and her isn't what you think. I only have boundless reverence for a pure and pious priest like the Archbishop. I don't dare to blaspheme her. Moreover, I can see that the Archbishop's current situation in chilly Winter Castle isn't good. Vera and Colin are using the Golden Lion Legion to suppress the resistance in Lion's Roar Castle. They are trying to push a mage's adopted daughter to the position of Dukes of the North. This is too ridiculous. Although young Master Joyce is being suppressed, you have to believe that there are many righteous northern frontier knights in the city. They won't allow. Shut up. Marquis Dawson interrupted Wales impatiently. Wales shrunk his head and didn't dare to speak again. You're only a chess piece in their hands. Do you really think that you're favored by Agiani? Moreover, the information provided by the other party might not be true. Even if it's true, it might be a scheme by the House of St. Hilda to sow discord. Only an idiot like you, whose brain is filled with wine and beauties, would be deceived and deceived. Wales opened his mouth. He wanted to defend the goddess in his heart, but when he saw his father's fierce eyes, he didn't dare to refute. He could only cower and hug his knees like a quail in the rain. Marquis Dawson saw his cowardly appearance and became angry. In the end, he could only sigh and wave his hand helplessly. He scolded, "Go back to sleep." Wales grimaced as he got up from the ground and walked out carefully. Marquis Dawson's unfriendly voice came from behind him. "Remember, if I find out that you're secretly contacting the church, I'll break your legs." Wales hastened his steps and ran away as if he was escaping. Marquis Dawson sighed desolately and shook his head. He seemed to have given up on his son. Afterwards, he picked up the letter that Wales had just handed to him, ready to see what kind of pie Archbishop Agiani had painted for the Dawson family. After opening the letter, Marquis Dawson's brows immediately furrowed. "This letter, why is it like this?" Before Marquis Dawson could understand it, footsteps could be heard from outside the tent, followed by the voice of a personal guard. "Master, Marminam requests an audience. Let him in." Chapter 276. Marquis Dawson, I hope I didn't disturb your rest? As soon as he entered, Marminam greeted him with a smile. Behind him was Count Anka. Marquis Dawson smiled as usual and said, "Of course not." After inviting the two of them to take a seat, Marquis Dawson ordered his guards to serve tea. He wasn't in a hurry as he quietly sipped his tea while waiting for Marquis Menham to explain his intentions. Before long, Marminam said, "Marquis Dawson, I'm sure you know that Anka has just returned from chilly Winter City." Marquis Dawson glanced at Count Anka and laughed as he asked, "How was the diplomatic mission? Did the House of St. Hilda agree to the peace talks?" "The House of St. Hilda's attitude is worse than we expected." Marquis Menham sighed. Count Anka interrupted and said, "I discovered that the House of St. Hilda already knows about Mr. Xing's death. This is beyond my expectations. Moreover, this makes the peace talks extremely difficult." Marquis Menham's expression was gloomy as he said coldly, "I reckon that someone on our side secretly leaked the information to the city. Otherwise, the House of St. Hilda wouldn't have known about Mr. Xing's death so quickly." Although Marquis Dawson was cursing his idiotic son in his heart, he didn't show it on his face. He even took the initiative to change the topic. He even changed the topic and said, "So, the House of St. Hilda doesn't agree to the peace talks?" Marquis Menham didn't expect that the good son of his ally had leaked the secret, so he didn't harp on this topic. He shook his head and said, "No. The House of St. Hilda is willing to negotiate. However, they raised an excessive condition. Marquis Dawson's heart skipped a beat as he thought of the information that his son had just brought back. He smiled and asked, "What condition?" Marquis Mem stared intently into Marquis Dawson's eyes and said word by word, "The House of St. Hilda wants me to hand you over." Marquis Dawson's expression changed, and his gaze became dangerous. He said in a deep voice, "Then, Marquis Menham, do you intend to accept this condition?" Marquis Menham stared intently into Marquis Dawson's eyes and didn't immediately reply. Marquis Dawson naturally stared back without giving in. The two of them were like wild beasts meeting on a narrow path as they engaged in a battle of life and death. The atmosphere in the tent became stagnant, and the air became suffocating. Count Anka instantly became restless and broke out in cold sweat. At the same time, he was extremely puzzled by his father's actions. Why did he purposely provoke us? Was he in the enemy's camp? Was he not afraid of being Menham's? S. Marquis Menham laughs Menham, S. He's laughed, S. Menham suddenly laughed, Menham's laughs. T. Menham, T. Menham S. Menham was relieved, but Menham was Menham, Marquis Dawson, do you think I will accept this condition? Marquis Menham asked with a relaxed expression. Marquis Dawson's face was full of smiles, as if he was welcoming his closest friend. Of course not. The Dawson family and the Menham family have a friendship that has lasted for 1,000 years. We are both the hope for the revival of the dwarves. Why would we kill each other? That's right. Marquis Menham clapped his hands and said loudly that Viscount Angley thinks he can use this kind of agreement to sow discord between us. He is too naive. Ha, since you are so honest, then I won't hide it. I have just received a letter from Archbishop Ajani. The letter warned me that the Menham family is prepared to betray the Dawson family. Oh? Marquis Menham's eyes turned and he laughed. Looks like Archbishop Ajani's relationship with you is very good. She actually helped you pass on the message. Marquis Dawson waved his hands. Sigh, I feel that this woman has bad intentions. She probably wants to use our Dawson family to do things for her. Indeed. Marquis Menham nodded. I don't even dare to get too close to that bewitching priestess for fear of being bewitched by her. You choosing to stay away from her is a very wise decision. Count Anka finally came back to his senses, and he immediately flattered with a smile. Yes, humans are too cunning. We dwarves should unite and fight against foreign enemies. Marquis Menham smiled and nodded, agreeing with his son's words. Then he saw the letter in Marquis Dawson's hand from the corner of his eye, and he asked, Is this the letter that Ajani sent? It's full of old tricks. She's too naive to think that she can trick me. Marquis Dawson magnanimously handed the letter to Marquis Menham and said, Do you want to take a look? Marquis Menham did not stand on ceremony and immediately took the letter. But then he frowned and asked, Why are there so many places that have been altered? Marquis Dawson did not mind and said, Oh, that's the original I received. Maybe the Archbishop was hesitant about the wording when she wrote the letter. Marquis Menham suspiciously glanced at Marquis Dawson, but he did not say anything. Instead, he carefully read the contents of the letter. After a while, he raised his head again and returned the letter to Marquis Dawson. He said, It seems that the situation in Winter City is not stable. Marquis Dawson nodded and said, That's right. There are definitely people in Lion's Roar Castle who do not want to see Vera inherit the title of Duke. Moreover, if Mr. Cheng's information is correct, the Oman family also has a blood feud with the Angeli family. The hidden resistance in the city cannot be underestimated. Perhaps we can make use of it. Marquis Menham rubbed his chin and seemed to be deep in thought. After a while, he nodded and said, This is indeed a feasible method. But how do we contact the people in the city? Marquis Dawson coughed awkwardly and said, I have a way to contact Archbishop Ajani, but I don't think she is trustworthy. Marquis Menham smiled and said, Then you don't have to trust her. We in the church are just using each other. You can pretend to agree to her request first and see what she has in mind for you. Marquis Dawson seemed to be moved. After thinking for a while, he nodded and said, Okay. I can think of a way to contact the people in the city and see if we can win over those who are dissatisfied with Vera. Good. Thank you for your hard work. You are welcome. Marquis Menham immediately stood up and said goodbye to Marquis Dawson. It was late at night outside the tent. There was no moon in the sky, only a little bit of starlight. Marquis Menham and his son walked quietly. When they returned to their own camp, Marquis Menham suddenly asked, "Do you think Marquis Dawson lied?" "Huh?" Earl Anka was stunned. "I don't think so." "Ah." Marquis Menham sneered and said, "Did you see the letter? It is full of traces of alteration. Marquis Dawson said that it was originally like this, but I think that he deliberately altered the important information after receiving the letter." Earl Anka thought for a while and nodded. "That is indeed possible." Marquis Menham continued, "Also, did you notice the handwriting on the letter?" Earl Anka suddenly felt a little awkward because he did not notice the handwriting. "Don't you feel that it is familiar?" Marquis Menham asked. Earl Anka thought carefully and suddenly had a flash of inspiration. He took out the peace negotiation agreement and said in surprise, "The handwriting on the letter is the same as the handwriting on the agreement." Marquis Menham nodded and asked, "I remember you saying that this agreement was written by Viscount Angley on the spot?" "That's right. I saw him write it with my own eyes." Earl Anka finally understood. So, that letter was not written by a Johnny to Marquis Dawson, but by Viscount Angley. Yes, Marquis Dawson must be lying. Marquis Menham's face was gloomy as he said, "Moreover, this is not the first lie that he has told. He is hiding other things?" Earl Anka was shocked. "Do you remember his reaction when I told him that someone in the camp leaked the news of Mr. Dusk's death to Winter City?" Earl Anka thought for a while and said in shock, "He did not react. Instead, he changed the topic." Marquis Menham sneered. "Don't you think it is strange that he is not concerned about something as important as a spy in the camp?" Count Anka immediately said, "Unless he was the one who arranged for the traitor." Marquis Menham sighed and suddenly stopped in his tracks. He turned back to look in the direction of the Dawson family's camp. "Farron Dawson, how do you expect me to trust you?" Chapter 277. The Dwarven messengers arrived at Winter City. This was the third time that Count Anker had been sent to Winter City, but this time he was not alone. Marquis Dawson's eldest son, Count Falco Dawson, accompanied him. Count Falco was different from the unreliable Wales. As the eldest son of Marquis Dawson, he had the demeanor of an heir of the Dawson family. Furthermore, he was calm and steady, and he was highly valued by Marquis Dawson. It was obvious that the Dawson family did not want to let the Menham family negotiate with the House of St. Hilda alone. Of course, this could also be seen as the close relationship between the Menham family and the Dawson family, and it was clear that they had foiled the enemy's plan. As for what the two dwarven families were thinking, only the people involved knew. However, Colin decided to hide with Vera and let Scholar Dwayne deal with the dwarven messengers. He knew that there was no way to make any progress with the Dawson family and the Menham family present at the same time. Therefore, Scholar Dwayne and the two dwarven counts talked for the whole day. It seemed like they were arguing with each other, but in the end, they realized that there was no consensus at all. Count Anker and Count Falco were angry, but there was nothing they could do. Scholar Dwayne had always maintained a friendly attitude, as if he was really willing to negotiate with the dwarves. However, there were some conditions that they could not agree on. During the banquet, Angeli and his wife, who had disappeared for the whole day, finally appeared. Count Anker and Count Falco went to talk to them for a while, but they did not get any meaningful answers. Colin just said, "You can talk to Scholar Dwayne. He can completely represent the House of St. Hilda." The two dwarven counts had no choice but to give up. They were thinking about how to deal with Scholar Dwayne, who seemed friendly, but was actually very difficult to deal with. The night was getting darker, and a place in the southern part of Winter City suddenly became lively. This was originally a deserted open space, but now it was densely packed with simple and crude tents. The tents were surrounded by thorny fences, and there was a sign at the entrance that read "Captive Camp." In the Battle of the Riverrun River, the Golden Lion Legion had defeated the Dawson clan's army, capturing roughly 15,000 prisoners. After entering chilly winter, the dwarf captives were settled here. Besides having a daily meal to prevent them from starving to death, nobody cared about them. But tonight, It seemed that someone important had come to the camp. What's wrong? What's going on? Holm whispered to his companion. I don't know. After asking a few rounds, he still didn't get a definite answer. Just as he was feeling puzzled, Holmoen suddenly heard cheers coming from the front, as if they had received some great news. What's going on? Are you going to let us go? Holmoen scratched his head anxiously, trying to figure out what was going on, but he could not squeeze to the front. But not long after, his squad leader ran back excitedly, shouting, The House of St. Hilda and the Dawson family have reached an agreement. There will be no more fighting. We can go home now. Really? We can go home? Happiness came too suddenly, and Holmoen could not believe it. The dwarven comrades around him had already begun to wail and howl in excitement. Then when are we leaving? Tomorrow? No, they'll let us go in a while. So fast. Holmoen was excited, and he could not wait to leave this place that brought him bad memories. Indeed, not long after, the door of the captive camp was completely opened. The dwarves lined up neatly under the orders of the officers, and slowly walked out. Along the way, Holmoen saw General Tumu. As a rank 5 warrior, General Tumu was highly respected in the Dawson clan's army. But after being captured, he had mysteriously disappeared, and no one knew where he went. But now that he had reappeared, the captives felt much more at ease. Even though they had not had enough to eat, the dwarf captives were still spirited, and they followed the orders of the Golden Lion Legion in an orderly manner. Holmoen was in the formation, and he looked around as he walked. Half an hour later, he realized that he had arrived at the city gate. The open city gate looked eerie under the night sky, but in the eyes of the dwarf captives, it was the door to hope. After walking out of chilly Winter Castle, Holmoen was finally sure that he was saved. Outside the city gate, there was a place for weapons. Every dwarf captive that passed through there would be given a weapon. Holmoen also received a long sword. Even though he would not be able to get back his leather armor and bow, a long sword made him feel more at ease. The atmosphere in the formation became more lively, and some of the dwarf captives even sang war songs to celebrate their new life. That night, the stars were sparse, and the boundless darkness shrouded the land. In this pitch-black night, no one knew what was waiting for the dwarf captives. Holmoen also sang along with his comrades, and his footsteps were light. Even the hunger that had been plaguing him all this time had temporarily disappeared. Suddenly, the formation in front stopped. In the darkness, military orders were not transmitted smoothly, and the dwarf captives were in chaos, but they were quickly suppressed by the officers. What's the matter? Holmoen was anxious again. We encountered the sentries of the Menham family, the captain comforted him. Holmoen heaved a sigh of relief, and then he became excited. This meant that they were very close to the dwarf camp. Perhaps they would be able to eat piping hot food soon. Just as Holmoen was immersed in the fantasy of food and was drooling, there was another commotion in front. What's the matter now? I'll go ahead and take a look. Stay where you are and don't run around. The captain instructed before he went ahead to investigate the situation. Holmoen could only wait patiently, but the hunger that had disappeared suddenly appeared again. It was much more intense than before, and Holmoen almost lost control of himself. As time passed, the dwarf captives did not receive any orders to advance. Meanwhile, the patience of Holmsen and the others was wearing thin in this endless wait. Anxiety and anger gradually spread among the captives. Why aren't we allowed to return? Why aren't we allowed to return? Suddenly, there was a commotion in front. Holmoen was on the verge of exploding when he saw the captain running back angrily. Captain, what's going on in front? The Menham family doesn't allow us to enter their camp. But they said that they didn't receive any news of the release of the captives. They also said that the family emissary is still in chilly Winter Castle. They didn't reach an agreement with the House of St. Hilda. Nonsense. We're back. How can they not reach an agreement? If they don't reach an agreement, will the Golden Lion Legion release us? While Holmoen was feeling indignant, the commotion in front escalated. Intense fighting sounds and screams could be heard. We want to go home. We're not enemies. We want to see Marquis Dawson. It was unknown who instigated it, but the dwarf captives confronted the Menham family. Their words became more and more intense, and they were on the verge of losing control. Rumble! The ground suddenly quaked. General Tumu smashed his large hammer heavily on the ground and roared, "Who dares to stop me?" After saying that, he took the lead and rushed into the Menham family's formation. His actions were like a spark falling into hot oil, instantly igniting a raging inferno. The dwarf captives, who had become extremely anxious from the long wait and hunger, exploded. Under General Tumu's lead, they charged towards the Menham family's camp. The night was dark, but the massacre had begun. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.